Hello, my dear listeners, and welcome to the Boring Sleep Library. If you think special substances are only a modern thing, you might notice they were also common in the Middle Ages, just part of daily routines, nothing unusual. People used ordinary items like church incense or herbal mixtures, not thinking much of them, just like they used bread or water. From priests to midwives, everyone used these things in their usual tasks. Nothing remarkable about it. At the Boring Sleep Library, we'll look at how these items were part of regular life, used by all sorts of people in their everyday work. So before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Boring Sleep Library. But only if you find these plain stories soothing. And if you'd like, comment where you're listening from and what time it is, though it's not terribly important. I'll read the comments later, perhaps. Now adjust your pillow to its usual spot. Pull your blanket up just right. Maybe turn on a fan for that familiar hum. And let's begin this ordinary tale at the Boring Sleep Library. If someone in medieval Europe reached the point where no treatment could cure their pain, the answer was not to fight against the illness, but to find a way to leave it behind for a little while. A farmer crushed under a falling cart, a woman who had given birth too many times, or an old man coughing blood in the winter would all eventually reach a stage where remedies no longer mattered. The doctors who had so few real cures turned instead to mixtures that dulled suffering. Wine, already common in daily life, became the base, and into it they added plants and resins that had strong effects on the body. Opium resin, brought in through trade, was one option. Mandrake root, long feared for its strange properties, was another. Henbane, with its bitter taste and dangerous strength, was also used. These substances did not save anyone. They allowed the patient to drift, to fall into a haze where the body was heavy but the mind seemed far away. Families saw this moment and called it mercy. The idea was not to heal, but to create a pause from agony. People who had seen their relatives screaming through the night would say that even 1 hour of quiet was a blessing. The drinks mixed by physicians were strong enough to pull a person out of their pain for a time, but they often carried risks that no one understood. Doses were measured by guesswork. A little too much could stop breathing. Little too little would not calm the body at all. Yet families accepted the danger. And in a world without antibiotics, without surgery that could repair, and without real knowledge of infection, they could only look for silence. It is striking that the same mixtures appear again and again in medieval records. Mandrake was feared for its shrieking reputation when pulled from the ground, but in small amounts it was considered a gift to those near death. Henbane was poisonous to animals, yet in carefully chosen doses, it was used as a sleeping draught. Opium resin, imported at a high price, was reserved for the sick who could not find rest in any other way. Each of these, when combined with alcohol, blurred the senses and created a sensation that many people came to seek, even when they were not at the edge of dying. What started as a tool for the desperate slowly became something desired in other situations. 2. The church sometimes looked on these practices with suspicion. Yet, even priests had to admit that the relief could seem miraculous. When a man racked with fever suddenly lay still and breathed calmly, the family gave thanks to God as well as to the medicine. No one wanted to believe that it was simply the effect of narcotics. They chose to see it as divine mercy. The patients themselves, if they were still conscious, often welcomed the haze after days or weeks of unbearable pain. The chance to float away from reality was enough to make them ask for more. It almost sounds comical that people feared demons in the shadows, but trusted a bottle filled with poison to be their last comfort. The pattern of use was clear. At first, mixtures were given to those who had no chance of survival, but then they began to spread. People who were not dying, only suffering from broken bones or lingering sickness, started to request them. Physicians who realized that their other remedies rarely worked began to rely more heavily on these potions. Instead of herbs for digestion or salves for wounds, they reached for the strongest sedatives in their cupboards. By doing so, they changed the culture of healing from trying to cure to simply trying to numb. For the poor, access was more limited, but it was still there. Local healers knew plants that grew in the fields and forests. They knew which roots and leaves carried power, and they prepared crude versions of the same sedatives. A woman in a small village might grind henbane and mix it into ale for her husband, who lay coughing with a chest infection. A shepherd with a broken leg might chew on dried mandrake, while his family prayed over him. These were not carefully measured doses, but they worked well enough to send the sufferer into sleep, and for many that was good enough. The wealthy had access to more refined mixtures. Apothecaries in towns and cities kept small jars of imported opium, often locked away until requested by a physician. These were added to wine or honey and presented in glass vials that looked elegant on the shelf. A noblewoman might keep one near her bed in case of sleepless nights. A knight recovering from wounds might be given a stronger preparation to keep him still. What united both rich and poor was the same belief that these substances were gifts of nature, not threats to life. Over time, the experience of drifting away became something more than just relief. It was remembered those who had once been on the edge of death but survived sometimes spoke of the strange calm that overcame them. They described how the world seemed distant, how voices sounded far away, and how their pain seemed to dissolve. These accounts spread, and soon others wished to feel the same, even if they were not suffering as badly. That is how a medicine meant for the dying began to shape the habits of the living. If we compare it to today, it would be like morphine being handed out freely at the local pharmacy for headaches and toothaches. The normalization of these mixtures is one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval medicine. People did not view them as dangerous. They were seen as part of the ordinary practice of care. A bottle of sedative might sit on the same shelf as a jar of dried lavender or a pot of honey. Families used them when the need arose, and rarely questioned whether the need was truly medical. This acceptance meant that use expanded. Slowly, villages and towns learned to expect that suffering could be dulled, even if only briefly. Doctors themselves became accustomed to prescribing these substances. Some kept records of how many drops to use or how long the effect lasted, but there was no scientific method guiding them. What they relied on was experience, passed down from teacher to student. The result was uneven. One patient might find themselves gently soothed, while another might never wake again. And still the practice continued, because in most cases, the relief was real, even if it was temporary. When looking at this part of history, it is easy to think that people were reckless. But in truth, they were desperate. They lived in a world of constant injury, infection, and untreatable disease. Their choices were not between safe and unsafe, but between suffering and silence. I cannot help but feel that if I lived then, I too would have taken the cup without asking what price it might demand later. The image of a medieval sick room tells the story clearly. A patient moaning in pain, a family gathered around, and a physician pouring a dark liquid into a wooden cup. The patient drinks, their body slackens, and for the first time in days, the room is quiet. The family looks at one another with relief. They do not think of addiction or danger. They only think of how precious this silence is. It is in that moment that we see how getting high in medieval times was not about pleasure, but about survival. What began as a way to ease the suffering of the dying soon spread further. And as it did, people discovered that altered states could serve purposes beyond medicine, leading them into strange new practices that touched religion, ritual, and even daily life. In medieval monasteries, silence was not only a practice, but a way of life. Days were marked by bells, chants, and prayers that repeated until they became part of the body's rhythm. Within those stone walls, monks tried to strip themselves of worldly distractions so that they might draw closer to God. For some, ordinary devotion was not enough. They believed that to truly hear the divine, they had to push the body beyond its limits. They fasted for days, sometimes weeks, eating only scraps of bread or drinking thin broth. Their bodies grew weak, their eyes hollow, and their minds restless. Hunger gnawed at their strength, and lack of food sharpened every sound and thought. What they called visions often began as the natural result of starvation. Sleep was another sacrifice. Monks woke in the middle of the night to chant, and some kept vigil for long hours without rest. When the body is denied sleep, it begins to play tricks. The lines between dream and reality blur. In the stillness of a cold chapel with candles flickering and shadow shifting, a monk could easily believe he had seen an angel pass by or heard a voice that did not belong to any brother. They recorded these experiences as holy encounters, but the descriptions show the clear marks of exhaustion. A brain worn down by long deprivation created images that felt more real than anything they had seen while awake. Incense added to this altered state. Monasteries burned large amounts of resin, frankincense, and myrrh. The smoke filled the air during prayers, seeping into lungs and clinging to stone walls. In a poorly ventilated room after hours of chanting and fasting, the combination of hunger, lack of sleep, and thick air created an overwhelming effect. The monks described feelings of floating, of leaving their bodies, of hearing voices that guided them. It is almost amusing that what they thought was the whisper of God may have been nothing more than their bodies failing under pressure. Herbal substances also played a role. Some monasteries cultivated gardens with plants that had strong effects when burned or brewed. Sage, juniper, or henbane could be used in rituals, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without knowledge of their strength. When mixed with incense, they made the air heavy and the mind unsteady. A monk sitting in meditation for hours might begin to feel as if he was seeing the heavens open. To him, it was proof of divine favor. To us, it is clear that the chemistry of plants and the fragility of the human body were at work together. The writings that survive from these experiences often speak in great detail. A monk might describe a vision of Christ standing in light, or angels singing, or terrifying demons rising from the floor. Modern readers can recognize the signs of hallucination. The images were too vivid, too strange, and too sudden to be ordinary prayer. If we compare it to today, it would be like someone staying awake for 3 days straight, breathing heavy smoke in a closed room, and then insisting that the things they saw in the corner were revelations. Not every monk sought such extremes, but those who did often gained reputations for holiness.
Ow.
Their brothers believed they had special access to the divine. Pilgrims traveled to hear their words or touch the walls of the places where visions were said to appear. The visions became part of the power of the monastery, attracting donations and strengthening its influence. What no one admitted was that these holy encounters were as much about biology as they were about faith. The cycle was self-reinforcing. A monk who starved himself and claimed to see a vision was praised, not questioned. Others tried to follow, hoping for the same gift. The practices of fasting, vigils, and long meditation became traditions that passed through generations. Over time, they were accepted as normal ways to deepen prayer. Few realized that these customs had the side effect of creating states of delirium that were mistaken for divine voices. The physical toll was immense. Bodies weakened, bones grew fragile, and illnesses spread quickly. Among those who denied themselves food and rest. Yet the promise of hearing God made the suffering seem worthwhile. A monk might collapse after days of vigil, and his brothers would call it proof of devotion. They did not see that the human body can only endure so much before it begins to break. I find it hard not to think that if I lived, then I too might have mistaken dizziness and faint voices for something greater. Monastic life was built on discipline, but discipline pushed to extremes often led to states that looked like madness from the outside. The difference was in the interpretation. To the monks, the trembling, the cries, the strange visions were marks of divine touch. To us, they are clear evidence of what happens when the body is deprived and the mind is overworked. Yet without the language of science, they had only the language of faith. These experiences shaped medieval spirituality. Tales of visions spread beyond the cloister walls and into villages. People believed that holy men had direct access to God and that their words could guide the living. The reputation of monasteries grew stronger with every story of a monk who saw the heavens open. Ordinary people struggling with their pain looked up to these figures as proof that the divine was close. In truth, the monks were as human as anyone caught in the same search for relief from suffering, and often carried away by the simple chemistry of hunger, smoke, and exhaustion. The image of a candle-lit chapel filled with smoke, where pale men knelt for hours, till they swayed and fell into visions, captures the mixture of faith and biology. That defined much of the medieval way of getting high. They did not use the word high, but they knew the feeling of leaving the world behind, if only for a little while. These visions were not the end of the story. As the practice of altered states spread, other groups outside the monastery discovered their own ways of reaching similar conditions, blending herbs and rituals that carried them even further from the ordinary world. In medieval villages, much of the knowledge of healing did not come from universities or scholars, but from women who lived close to the land. They were midwives, herbalists, and caretakers who knew the plants of the fields and forests better than most men of learning. When a child was born, when a wound needed cleaning, or when a sickness spread, these women were called. They had baskets of dried herbs, jars of oils, and recipes passed down from older generations. Among their tools were plants that carried powerful alkaloids. These were not mild remedies like chamomile or mint. They were belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and ate. In small doses, they dulled pain and eased fear. In larger doses, they created visions and sensations that took people far from the ordinary world. The methods of using these plants were varied. Some were ground into powders and mixed with fat or oil to create ointments. These ointments were rubbed on the skin where the compounds entered the body slowly. Others were brewed into strong concoctions, though drinking them was dangerous and sometimes deadly. Still others were burned so that the smoke could be inhaled. The result was the same, a drifting, floating feeling where the body felt light and the mind slipped into strange images. Villagers whispered that these women could fly or commune with spirits. What they were truly doing was experimenting with the chemistry of plants. It is almost darkly humorous that what terrified inquisitors as witchcraft was often nothing more than the side effects of a strong herbal paste. These women did not use their knowledge for amusement. Their world left little room for play. Instead, they reached for these methods to cope with pressures that weighed heavily on them. Women in medieval society had few rights and little power. They were expected to marry, bear children, and remain under the authority of men. For those who lived on the edges of villages or who never married, the role of healer or midwife offered a kind of independence. But independence came with isolation and suspicion. In their solitude, these women often relied on their herbs not only to serve others, but also to find escape for themselves. The floating sensation, the brief journey outside ordinary awareness, was a way to loosen the bonds of a rigid world. The reputation of flight is one of the most enduring. Tales spread that witches rode through the night sky on broomsticks. In reality, ointments made from henbane or belladonna and applied to sensitive areas of the skin produce vivid hallucinations of flying. A woman who lay still after applying such a mixture might truly feel her body lifting and soaring. To her, it was a real journey. To her neighbors, who saw her speak of strange travels, it was proof of sorcery. Broomstick became a symbol not because of magic, but because the ointments were often applied with a staff or stick coated in the mixture. If we compare it to today, it would be like using a pharmaceutical hallucinogen and then insisting that the visions were literal experiences of travel. Records from trials and inquisitions describe these experiences in detail. Judges wrote down confessions in which women said they had flown, danced with spirits, or joined strange gatherings at night. What the court saw as evidence of witchcraft were in fact the reports of people under the influence of powerful plants. The women were punished not for magic, but for their knowledge of chemistry that was centuries ahead of its time. Despite the risks, people still came to them for help. A woman in labor might be given a small dose of mandrake to dull the agony of childbirth. A man with a deep wound might be soothed with henbane smoke to calm his cries. The same substances that created visions were also the only painkillers available in many communities. The line between medicine and hallucination was thin, and these women walked it every day. Their role in society was complicated. They were needed and feared at the same time. Villagers respected their knowledge, but whispered about their powers. Church authorities often condemned them, yet even priests sometimes looked the other way when their skill saved lives. The women themselves lived in the tension between serving their communities and protecting themselves from suspicion. To them, the herbs were tools. To others, they were signs of danger. Over time, the image of the witch was shaped by these practices. The ointments, the smoke, the trances, and the visions became stories of demonic pacts and midnight flights. The reality was more ordinary, but no less remarkable. These women had discovered how to use the plants around them to alter the mind, to create moments of release from unbearable pain and pressure. I cannot help but feel that their search for escape was not so different from ours today, only with far fewer safeguards and far more risk. What stands out is that these women were not trying to rebel against society in open defiance. They were finding hidden ways to breathe within a system that allowed them little space. Their practices were not about indulgence. They were about survival, both physical and emotional. the sensation of floating. The dreamlike visions, the easing of pain, were ways to endure lives that were otherwise harsh and narrow. The medieval world branded them witches, but in truth they were early experimenters with altered states. Their knowledge of plants, though dangerous, gave them power over suffering. It also placed them in constant danger of persecution. The line between healer and witch was drawn not by what they did, but by who chose to judge them. The sight of a woman grinding herbs by candlelight, preparing an ointment that might ease childbirth or send her into a trance, is one of the clearest images of how medieval people got high. It was not entertainment. It was a small rebellion against pain and a brief escape from a rigid order. From the silence of the cloisters to the secret work of village healers, the pursuit of altered states was spreading. And soon it would step onto the battlefield where warriors turned to drink and strange plants to face death without fear. On the fields where battles were fought in medieval Europe, the fear of death was heavy in the air. Men carried spears, swords, and axes, but they also carried dread. Facing an enemy in close combat meant knowing that every swing could be the last. To overcome this fear, some warriors turned to substances that altered their minds. Before the clash, they drank wine mixed with mandrake, a plant known to cause visions and dull pain. Others consumed mushrooms that carried hallucinogenic properties. These preparations did not sharpen skills or improve strategy. What they did was push fear out of the mind and replace it with a reckless sense of invincibility. For the men who swallowed these mixtures, stepping onto the battlefield became easier because their sense of reality was already shifting. The effect was powerful but unpredictable. The mandrake numbed fear, but it also blurred judgment. The mushrooms heightened aggression, but they also distorted vision and balance. Warriors sometimes fought with wild energy, ignoring wounds that should have brought them down. They shouted, charged, and swung their weapons with terrifying force. But just as often, the same substances caused confusion. A man could just as easily strike a friend as a foe, or stumble into danger without realizing it. The gamble was accepted because fear was considered a worse enemy than confusion. A man forgot his terror, even at the cost of reason. The army saw it as a kind of strength. It is almost funny that an army thought mushrooms could replace discipline, when in reality, they only made the battlefield look like a tavern brawl gone wrong. Folktales from the period describe these warriors in glowing terms. They tell of men who fought without pain, who continued to swing their swords even with deep wounds, who seemed possessed by something beyond human. In some stories, these fighters were believed to be under the protection of spirits or gods. They were said to enter a state of frenzy that no ordinary man could withstand. To the people who told the tales, this was proof of divine favor. To us, it looks like the clear mark of altered states brought on by substances that dulled pain and sharpened frenzy. The rituals before battle often reinforced these effects. Drinking together was not only about sharing strength, but about making an oath. Blood was sometimes mixed with the drink, sealing a promise that no man would flee. Once the mixture of wine, mandrake, or mushrooms took hold, the warriors believed they had bound themselves to something greater than their fear. Their shouts grew louder, their movements more violent, their eyes unfocused. Villagers who later heard of these scenes passed them down as stories of men who felt no pain. In truth, the pain was still there. Their minds had been pushed so far from the ordinary awareness that they could not respond to it. The connection between intoxication and violence was not unique to one region. Across Europe, Different groups found similar ways to blunt fear before facing death. In the north, sagas speak of fighters who howled like beasts and tore through their enemies without hesitation. In central and southern lands, chronicles mention soldiers drinking strange brews before charging into battle. The common thread is clear substances that altered the mind were used to turn ordinary men into figures of terror, if only for a short time. This practice had consequences. Some battles descended into chaos because intoxicated fighters ignored orders. Commanders struggled to keep control when men lost all sense of discipline, yet the memory of their ferocity lingered longer than the memory of their mistakes. Stories focused on their fearlessness, not on the confusion they caused. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like soldiers entering combat after taking hallucinogens, then being remembered as heroes for their wild courage, rather than for the chaos that followed for the men themselves. The experience was intense. They felt power coursing through them, as though nothing could touch them. Wounds that would normally drop them to the ground seemed distant, as if happening to someone else. The mix of chemicals in their bodies and the roar of battle around them created a storm inside the mind. In that storm, pain and fear were drowned out. The cost often came later when the body collapsed from exhaustion, or when madness lingered long after the fighting was done. Communities that survived these warriors told stories for generations. Children grew up hearing about men who charged into battle without flinching, who fought until their last breath, who seemed to stand between human and spirit. These tales added to the myth of invincible fighters. But behind the myth was a simpler truth. They had consumed substances that changed their minds, and those changes made them act in ways that others could not explain. It is important to remember that not all soldiers followed these practices. Many fought sober, relying on courage and training. But the image of intoxicated warriors was powerful, because it captured something people longed to believe, that fear could be defeated. Whether through magic, gods, or plants, the dream of a fearless fighter inspired both awe and dread. I think if I had lived in those times, I would have been tempted to drink as well, not to gain strength, but just to make the fear smaller. The picture of warriors standing on the edge of battle, drinking bitter brews, swearing oaths, and then charging forward in frenzy shows how deeply substances had entered the culture of survival. It was not about joy or celebration. It was about facing death without breaking. As the stories of fighters spread, other parts of medieval life also carried practices that led to unexpected intoxication, especially during festivals where ordinary villages joined together in drink, dance, and ritual fire that carried them into states of collective energy. Life in medieval villages was tied to the seasons. Planting, harvesting, and the long winter months shaped the rhythm of every year. When summer came and the fields were green, people gathered for festivals that broke the routine of labor. These celebrations were filled with music, dancing, and food. But they also carried something unexpected. Without realizing it, many villages slipped into states that today we would recognize as mild intoxication. It was not planned, nor was it deliberate. It was a natural result of what they ate, what they drank, and the way they filled the night with noise and fire. Alcohol was always part of these events. Wine and ale were brewed at home, often with little control over fermentation. A jug might contain a mild drink one day and a much stronger brew the next. People drank deeply, not counting cups or measuring strength. For many, the taste of sour wine or thick ale was the flavor of celebration itself. Alongside the alcohol came bread and other foods that had their own surprises. Rye, when infected with a fungus known as ergot, could carry compounds that caused visions and tremors. Villagers who ate bread from such grains sometimes felt dizzy or restless without understanding why. They blamed spirits or demons, never guessing that it was the mold hidden in their food. The fires added another layer. Bonfires were central to many festivals, whether to mark midsummer, drive away evil, or celebrate the harvest. Large piles of wood, resin, and herbs were burned, filling the air with smoke that clung to clothes and skin. Inhaling this smoke for hours while standing close and breathing heavily changed how people felt. Combined with the alcohol and food, it created a haze that blurred the line between ordinary wakefulness and altered states. It is almost amusing that what villagers thought was holy smoke might have been nothing more than the fumes of resin making them lighted. Music carried the crowd further. Drums, pipes, and string instruments played the same patterns again and again, creating rhythms that drew people into a trike state. Dancing around the fire, stamping feet, clapping hands, and spinning in circles made the body dizzy. Hours of this, with little rest and constant excitement, pushed the senses beyond normal boundaries. By the middle of the night, people felt as though they were floating together in one wave of energy. To them, it was joy and community. To us, it looks like the effect of overstimulation mixed with intoxicants. Staying awake long into the night deepened the feeling. Most villages usually rose with the sun and slept not long after dusk. Festivals broke this pattern. Fires burned until morning. Songs echoed through the dark and children ran about without being called to bed. Fatigue added its influence. Eyes blurred, thoughts slowed, and perception grew hazy. When mixed with alcohol, smoke, and music, fatigue created an atmosphere where visions and strange sensations seemed completely natural. The result was a kind of collective intoxication. No one person was singled out for unusual behavior, because everyone shared the same state. People laughed louder, danced harder, and claimed to see things in the flames or hear voices in the night. Some described feeling touched by spirits or filled with new strength. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like a neighborhood barbecue where the food was contaminated, the drinks were too strong, and the music never stopped until dawn, leaving everyone convinced they had experienced something magical. These communal highs reinforced beliefs in the sacred power of festivals. Villagers saw them as times when the boundary between the human and the divine grew thin. They believed the fire purified them. The music carried them closer to spirits, and the food and drink connected them with the cycle of the earth. What they did not realize was that chemistry and exhaustion were playing equal parts in shaping their experiences. Still, the meaning was real to them. The sense of energy that filled the village during these nights was remembered long afterward. People spoke of feeling renewed, of being closer to one another, of sharing something that could not be explained in ordinary terms. The social bond created by shared intoxication was stronger than any sermon or law. These events reminded the community that they belonged to each other and to the land that sustained them. I cannot help but think that if I were there, I too would have danced until morning. Swept along by the same haze of smoke, drink, and music. Not all festivals ended peacefully. Sometimes the combination of altered states and crowded gatherings led to fights or accidents. A villager might stumble into the fire, or tempers might flare after too much drink. Yet these events did not stop the traditions. The benefits in the eyes of the people outweighed the risks. To them, Festivals were essential moments of release in lives otherwise ruled by labor and hardship. The image of a village square filled with people swaying to music, drinking strong ale, and breathing smoke while flames lit the night sky shows how entire communities could be carried into altered states together. It was not recognized as intoxication. It was called a celebration. The villagers did not seek escape in the way a dying patient or a desperate healer did. Instead, they stumbled into it while honoring the cycles of nature. As these collective experiences became part of tradition, other groups began to experiment more deliberately, seeking not just celebration, but hidden truths, crafting elixirs and strange brews that promised power far beyond ordinary life. In the medieval imagination, there was always a fascination with secret knowledge. Alchemists, men who claimed to hold the keys to transformation, stood at the edge of medicine, magic, and philosophy. They were not simple healers who worked with herbs in the open air. They worked in chambers filled with glass vessels, powders, and strange liquids. Their goal was not only to cure sickness, but to unlock deeper truths of existence. One of the ways they promised to do this was through elixirs. These were bottled mixtures of alcohol, resins, and plants that they claimed could lengthen life, bring wisdom, or open hidden doors of perception. Villagers and nobles alike were drawn to them because the promise of an elixir sounded like a shortcut to strength, health, or enlightenment. The recipes were rarely written down in clear terms. Alchemists valued secrecy. They described their mixtures in coded language, mixing spiritual symbols with practical instructions. A bottle might contain wine infused with frankincense, myrrh, and resin from exotic trees. Into this, they might add crushed seeds or roots that carried alkaloids capable of altering the mind. Sometimes opium resin found its way into the blend brought by traders from the East. Sometimes belladonna or henbane was included, their dangerous properties disguised by layers of other flavors. The result was unpredictable. One sip might calm the body and sharpen the mind. Another might cause dizziness, confusion, or violent visions. It is almost funny that people believe these bottles contain the secret of the universe, when they often contain nothing more than badly mixed plant poisons. Elixirs were sold as gifts of wisdom. Alchemists claimed that their concoctions could purify the body and spirit, allowing drinkers to reach states of clarity unavailable in ordinary life. Some who drank reported moments of insight where ideas seemed to flow freely and problems felt simple. They described hearing voices, seeing patterns, or understanding the world in new ways. To them, this was proof that the elixir worked. To others, it was little more than the effect of intoxication. The blurred line between chemical reaction and spiritual revelation made the elixir a powerful tool for those who wanted to believe. The reputation of elixirs spread quickly. Nobles purchased them at high prices, convinced that they could unlock hidden potential. Merchants carried them across borders, selling them as rare treasures. Apothecaries stocked smaller versions, watered down but still strong enough to affect the body. People spoke of alchemists who had achieved visions, who had glimpsed the divine, or who had survived illnesses others could not. These stories added to the aura of mystery. Few asked how many others had lost their reason or their lives in the same pursuit. There were always dangers. Some who drank too much fell into deep sleep and never woke. Others lost their senses, wandering through streets, muttering about things no one else could see. Families sometimes hid relatives who had been ruined by elixir, ashamed to admit that the search for wisdom had left them broken. Yet the promise remained strong enough that people continued to buy. In times of uncertainty, the hope of finding answers in a bottle outweighed the fear of harm. If we compare it to today, it would be like someone buying an untested supplement online, because it claimed to unlock genius only to end up in the hospital instead. The alchemists themselves believed they were working with sacred forces. To them, alcohol was not just a drink, but a solvent that carried the essence of plants. Resins were the captured souls of trees condensed into solid form. When combined, they thought these materials could connect the human body to higher planes of existence. Their laboratories were half workshop, half temple. Glass bottles glowed in firelight, powders were measured with careful hands. The air was heavy with smoke from burning herbs. The atmosphere alone was enough to make a visitor feel as if they had stepped into a place of mystery. Those who drank often described the experience in glowing terms. A nobleman might say he felt his spirit rise above his body. A monk might write that the elixir opened the gates of heaven. A merchant might swear that he suddenly understood the secrets of trade and fortune. These accounts made the elixir more popular, spreading their reputation far beyond the walls of the alchemist chamber. The truth, however, was that each person was reacting not to divine truth, but to the chemical effects of the blend. The sense of clarity was temporary, and the price that followed was often exhaustion, confusion, or worse. Despite this, the belief in elixir endured. Alchemists were respected, feared, and ridiculed all at once, but they were never ignored. They filled a role that no doctor or priest could. They offered access to something beyond the ordinary world, even if their mixtures harmed as often as they helped. The possibility of transformation was too alluring for people to turn away. I find it easy to imagine that if I lived then, I too might have sipped from one of those bottles, hoping for wisdom, and only later realizing that what I had found was a fog I could not escape. The image of an alchemist workshop shows why the elixir captured so much imagination. A dim room lit by fire, shelves lined with glass, powders, and herbs scattered across wooden tables. In the center, a bottle filled with dark liquid promised answers to anyone brave enough to drink. The atmosphere combined fear and hope in equal measure. Those who drank believed they were stepping closer to eternity. Those who watched wondered whether they were witnessing enlightenment or madness. As time went on, the stories of alchemists and their elixirs merged into folklore. Some were remembered as wise men who touched divine truth. Others were condemned as frauds or sorcerers who led people astray. In both cases, the elixir remained at the heart of the tale, symbolized the human desire to escape the limits of ordinary life, to break through into something larger. Whether it brought joy, madness, or death, it always promised more than the everyday. In this pursuit, medieval people showed the same pattern seen in every other part of their lives. They turned to what was available, mixed it with belief, and accepted the risks for the chance of something greater. The elixir was never just a drink. It was a dream in liquid form, a fragile bridge between suffering and hope. From the dim workshops of alchemists, the use of smoke and resins did not remain locked away. It moved into churches and sanctuaries where incense became a powerful part of worship, filling the air with scents that carried the faithful into states they thought were holy. For most medieval people, the church was the center of life. It was not only the place for prayer and ritual, but also the stage where every important event was marked from birth to death. The experience of entering a medieval church was overwhelming. High stone walls echoed with chants. Stained glass filtered the light into deep colors, and thick clouds of incense rolled through the air. To the faithful, this smoke was a symbol of prayer rising to heaven. To those inside for hours at a time, it was more than a symbol. It was a substance that entered the lungs, settled into the body, and changed the way they felt. The incense most often used was made from frankincense and myrrh. These resins burned slowly over hot coals, released a rich, heavy aroma that filled every corner of the church. At first, the scent was calming, but as the hours passed, it grew dense. People breathing it in were not simply smelling a pleasant fragrance. They were inhaling compounds that had subtle effects on the nervous system. The result was a sensation of lightness, a dulling of sharp thought, and sometimes even mild euphoria. It is almost amusing that what was believed to be the presence of God may have been nothing more than the chemistry of tree sap. The architecture of the church made this effect stronger. Stone walls trapped the smoke, allowing it to build with each passing service. In smaller chapels with little ventilation, the air grew thick enough to sting the eyes and coat the throat. Worshippers sat or knelt in the haze, listening to chants repeated endlessly by monks or priests. The combination of rhythmic sound and heavy air created an atmosphere that could easily tip the body into a trance. People described feeling as though time slowed, as though their thoughts drifted beyond themselves. Many believed they had entered a holy state of vision. The ritual use of incense was deliberate. Church leaders valued it for its symbolism, but they also saw the effect it had on worshippers. A congregation subdued by smoke and sound was more receptive to the message of the sermon. People left the building not only convinced of spiritual truths, but also deeply moved by what felt like a direct encounter with the divine. The mixture of faith and biology was powerful. To question it was unthinkable. Accounts from the period show how often visions were reported in such churches. Ordinary men and women claimed to see angels, to feel the hand of God, or to hear voices that told them what to do. Pilgrims wrote of collapsing in tears or laughter, convinced that they had touched heaven. The intensity of these reports makes sense when one considers the physical conditions. After hours, without food, surrounded by chants, candles, and smoke, the body naturally slid into a state of altered perception. If we compare it to today, it would be like sealing hundreds of people in a room filled with aromatic smoke and then being surprised. When some claimed to see things that were not really there, the priests themselves were not immune. Those who handled incense regularly breathed in far more than ordinary worshippers. Their long hours in smoky spaces left them elated and sometimes unsteady. Some chroniclers note that priests collapsed during services or spoke with unusual intensity as though carried by a force beyond themselves. These incidents were often explained as divine inspiration, but the physical explanation is equally strong. Despite the risks, incense was never abandoned. It became so central to worship that services without it were considered incomplete. The scent itself became linked with holiness. So much so that even today, it is still used in many traditions. Medieval people could not separate the aroma from the sense of the sacred. For them to smell frankincense was to be in the presence of God. The possibility that it was altering their perception never occurred to them. The psychological effects were strengthened by expectation. People entered the church already believing that they were about to encounter the divine. When the smoke blurred their senses, they accepted it as confirmation. The faint dizziness, the warmth in the chest, and the dreamlike focus all became proof of the presence of God. Communities treasured these experiences and encouraged one another to seek them. The cycle fed itself generation after generation, until the association between incense and vision was unbreakable. Even the design of rituals encouraged altered states, the repetition of prayers, the low drone of chants, the swaying of processions, and the flickering of candles all worked together with the incense. This kind of sensory saturation can easily push the human mind into a trance. To people with little understanding of biology, the explanation was obvious. They were witnessing miracles. I cannot help but think that if I lived in those times, I too would have left a smoky chapel, convinced I had glimpsed heaven. For ordinary villagers, these moments were some of the only breaks from the harshness of daily life. Service that lifted them into visions, whether real or imagined, was a treasure. It allowed them to believe they were part of something larger, that their suffering had meaning. The combination of incense, ritual, and exhaustion gave them hope. It may not have been the voice of God, but it was powerful enough to shape lives. The image of a crowded medieval church filled with smoke so thick it hung in beams of candlelight shows clearly how people could slip into altered states without realizing it. They were not seeking intoxication, they were seeking God. Yet the result was the same as in so many other places. A body overwhelmed by the environment, a mind carried beyond its usual boundaries. From the smoke of sanctuaries to the secretive rites of heretical groups, the blending of intoxication with religion did not stop inside the church. It spilled into strange gatherings where faith, sexuality, and potions combined, creating experiences that frightened authorities and fascinated those who heard the rumors. Beyond the walls of the church and the order of monasteries, there were always groups that rejected official authority. These were the heretical sects, small gatherings of people who believed they had found a truer path to the divine. Many of them met in secret, often at night, away from the watchful eyes of priests and nobles. In these hidden meetings, rituals took place that mixed elements of worship, sexuality, and intoxicating substances. To outsiders, these gatherings were monstrous. To participants, they were liberating. They believed that in breaking boundaries, they could reach truths that ordinary life denied them. The key to many of these rituals was a potion that they called a holy drink. Recipes varied, but most contained strong alcohol blended with herbs that carried stimulating or hallucinogenic properties. Mandrake, belladonna, or henbane might be included. Sometimes opium resin appeared, sometimes crushed seeds with strange effects. When taken in groups under candlelight and chanting, the drink produced feelings of warmth, euphoria, and disconnection from the ordinary world. Participants believed they were filled with divine energy. It is almost darkly humorous that what some called the Spirit of God was likely just the rush of alkaloids flooding their nervous systems. The drink was only part of the ritual. Once intoxication began, the sects often broke social and moral rules that defined ordinary life. Some stripped away clothing as a sign of rejecting worldly shame. Others engaged in sexual acts believing that passion itself could be a form of worship. The substances they consumed lowered inhibitions, making it easier to cross lines they might never have dared in the daylight. They thought they were stepping into sacred freedom. In reality, they were simply carried by chemistry and suggestion. The authorities found these rituals both shocking and dangerous. Rumors spread quickly that heretics held orgies in the woods or performed obscene rites in abandoned barns. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, they contained kernels of truth. Stimulating substances, darkness, and the rejection of rules did produce behavior that looked wild to outsiders. The church labeled these sects as blasphemous and demonic. Trials were held, punishments were severe, and many were executed for their gatherings. Still, the practices never fully disappeared. The human hunger for both transcendence and release was too strong to erase. The writings that survive about these rituals show how powerful the experiences were for those inside them. People claim to have visions of angels and demons, to feel themselves lifted out of their bodies, to hear voices that guided them. The blending of intoxication and sexual release made the sensations even more intense. In a society where ordinary people lived under constant rules and strict controls, these nights felt like freedom. They returned to their daily lives convinced they had touched something divine. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like people gathering for a rave with hallucinogens, only to call the whole thing a holy service. Not every participant sought pleasure. For many, the purpose was spiritual. They believed that the body had to be broken down to release the soul, by stripping away clothing, drinking the holy potion, and giving themselves over to frenzied acts. They thought they were crossing into a higher state of being. The altered states created by drugs reinforced this belief. They mistook their visions for revelations and their impulses for divine commands. For women especially, these rituals offered something different from ordinary life. In the broader society, women were expected to obey, to remain silent, and to stay under the control of husbands or fathers. In the sects, intoxication and ritual gave them space to act without those limits. They could speak, move, and desire freely. The authorities saw this as proof of corruption. The women themselves may have seen it as the only moments when they could feel alive outside the chains of custom. I cannot help but think that if I lived in such restrictions, the chance to drink, to forget rules, and to feel part of something greater would have been irresistible. The repression of these sects was harsh. Armies of church and state hunted them down. Entire groups were destroyed in raids, and survivors were paraded through towns as warnings. Chroniclers wrote with horror about what they claimed to have found. But even in the anger of their words, there is a sense of fascination. The idea that ordinary villagers could abandon their identities fueled by smoke and potions terrified and intrigued those in power. It revealed how fragile social control could be when confronted with intoxication and passion. Despite the violence of repression, the stories lingered. Generations repeated tales of heretics who met under the moon, who drank potions, who cast off shame, and who claimed to see visions. In many cases, the memory of these rituals became more exaggerated over time, feeding into the later image of witches' sabbaths and secret gatherings. What began as sectarian rites became part of a larger folklore of forbidden intoxication. The image is vivid. A circle of men and women gathered at night, drinking a bitter potion from shared cups, smoke rising from burning herbs. Music and chanting, echoing, bodies swaying until the boundaries of self and society dissolved. To participants, it was liberation. To outsiders, it was sin. Both perspectives show the same truth, that substances and ritual together had the power to reshape human behavior. In these secret rites, we see one of the clearest examples of how drugs, sexuality, and belief could fuse into something explosive in medieval life. It was not about recreation. It was about breaking free, if only for a night, from the narrow world of rules and fear. That freedom carried a terrible cost, but the desire for it never disappeared. From the hidden sects that met in darkness, the story of intoxication moved outward again into the lives of wanderers and outcasts. people who lived beyond law and order, and who carried their habits into the roads and alleys of medieval towns. In every medieval society, some did not belong anywhere. They were the wanderers, the drifters, and the nameless figures who moved from village to village with no fixed home. Some were beggars. Some were deserters from armies, and some were outcasts driven away for crimes or misfortune. Among them was a group that came to be feared more than most. The ones who were constantly under the influence of intoxicating plants and drinks. These people lived on the edge of survival, scavenging whatever they could find and using whatever substance might numb their hunger or pain. Over time, they became symbols of disorder, unpredictable and dangerous, both pied and hated. The substances they used were crude. Unlike nobles with access to expensive potions or monks with carefully measured incense, wanderers relied on what they could gather or steal. Any liquid that had fermented, whether fruit juice left too long in the sun or scraps of grain soaked in water, became their drink. Moldy bread, spoiled ale, or dregs of wine from taverns served the same purpose. When no alcohol was available, they chewed roots and leaves of plants that carried toxic qualities. Henbane, thorn apple, or even pieces of mandrake root might be gnawed in desperation. The effects were unpredictable. Some staggered through villages, laughing and shouting. Others collapsed in ditches, twitching and foaming. It is almost bitterly funny that people with nothing had to settle for the most dangerous highs. While the wealthy sipped their opium wine in safety, villagers feared these figures. They appeared suddenly with wild eyes and slurred speech. Sometimes half-naked, sometimes carrying strange charms or sticks they claimed had power. Children were told to stay away, and adults locked their doors at night when wanderers were near. Tales spread of robberies, assaults, or fires started by men too intoxicated to know what they were doing. The presence of such people reminded communities of the thin line between order and chaos. In villages already struggling to survive, one unpredictable stranger could cause weeks of fear. Yet fear was not the only reaction. In some cases, wanderers under the influence were believed to carry messages from beyond. Their mutterings, their strange visions, and their sudden outburst was seen by some as prophetic. A woman who raved about fire might be remembered when a barn later burned down. A man who shouted about famine might be quoted when the crops failed. As villagers, uncertain how to explain these coincidences, sometimes saw in the intoxicated ramblings a glimpse of fate. What to one person was madness, to another looked like a divine warning. If we compare it to today, it would be like treating the incoherent words of a homeless addict as breaking news about the future. This uneasy balance of fear and belief gave the wanderers a strange place in society. They were shunned, but they were also sometimes listened to. A village might chase them away one day and then whisper about their words the next. Local priests condemned them as agents of the devil, but peasants who lived close to the land often wondered if they carried truths hidden from ordinary eyes. The combination of intoxication and outsider status made them mysterious. Even when they were simply suffering from the poisons they consumed, the lives of these people were short and harsh. Without steady food or shelter, their bodies weakened quickly. Constant use of toxic plants damaged their minds and organs. Many died young, alone on the roadside, or buried without a name. But their image lived longer than their bodies. Chronicles mention them as warnings, and folklore preserved their presence as half-mad prophets or cursed souls. They became figures that stood for everything unsettled in medieval life: poverty, danger, and the lure of strange visions. The law rarely showed mercy. Wanderers caught in towns could be beaten, branded, or expelled. If accused of theft or violence, they might be hanged without much. Question: those clearly under the influence of strange plants were sometimes brought before church courts accused of witchcraft or possession. The line between madness, intoxication, and sin was never clearly drawn. For authorities, it was easier to punish than to understand. Despite this, the image of the intoxicated wanderer fascinated people. In songs and stories, they appeared as figures of chaos, stumbling through villages with wild laughter or shouting predictions no one wanted to hear. Children learned to fear them, but also to remember their words. The contrast between their ragged appearance and their mysterious visions made them unforgettable. In a world that valued order and faith, they embodied disorder and doubt. It is striking to see how different social classes experienced intoxication. The noble lady sipping a measured potion in her chamber was praised for her refinement. The monk breathing smoke in a chapel was honored for his visions. The peasant healer using herbs was both respected and feared. But the wanderer, with no home and no standing, was condemned as dangerous. I cannot help but think that the only real difference was that the poor had no choice but to consume what others threw away, and society judged them for the results. These figures did not fit neatly into categories. They were neither holy visionaries nor deliberate seekers of pleasure. They were people crushed by hunger, cold, and despair, numbing themselves with whatever they could find. Their altered states were not chosen for enlightenment or celebration. They were desperate escapes from reality, brief flights away from misery. In that sense, they reveal another side of how medieval people got high, one shaped not by curiosity or ritual, but by survival at its lowest edge. The picture of a ragged man staggering through a village, his eyes red, his words jumbled, and his body weak. While children hide behind their mothers and elders mutter prayers, shows clearly how intoxicants created fear when linked to poverty. It was not only the substances themselves that mattered, but also who used them. For the rich, intoxication was elegance or piety. For the outcast, it was a mark of shame. The legacy of these wanderers lingered long after they were gone. Folklore turned them into characters who foretold disasters, warned of plagues, or carried curses. Villages remembered them not only for the trouble they caused, but also for the strange fascination they inspired. In the end, they stood as reminders of the fragile line between suffering and vision, between madness and prophecy. From the roads where wanderers staggered, the story of intoxication did not stop. It continued into the very cradles of medieval households, or even infants were not spared. The touch of substances that promised peace at a terrible price. In the medieval household, constant noise was a fact of life. Families were large, rooms were crowded, and work left little time for rest. Among the most exhausting challenges was the cry of infants. Babies were rarely left alone. They slept near the fire beside their mothers or in cradles pulled close to beds. Their cries echoed through small timber houses, keeping entire families awake at night. Mothers already burdened with endless labor sought ways to bring silence. One of the answers they turned to was a soothing drink, a mixture drawn from roots and herbs that dulled a baby's senses. These concoctions became the first intoxicants many children ever received. The ingredients were known to women who cared for households. Roots such as mandrake or henbane were sometimes steeped in water, creating a bitter liquid with sedative qualities. Drops of this were placed on a baby's tongue or mixed with milk. The effect was swift. The child stopped crying, grew drowsy, and sank into long sleep. For mothers who had to grind grain, fetch water, or tend animals, this was a relief too great to question. The cost of using such drinks was hidden, and many never realized the danger. It is almost grimly funny that a society so afraid of demons did not hesitate to give poison to its children in the name of peace. Other methods were common. Some women rubbed ointments containing sedative herbs on their breasts or on cloths used to nurse babies. The infants sucking or chewing absorbed the compounds without knowing. In some households, a piece of cloth dipped in the mixture was tied near the cradle, allowing fumes to calm the baby through the night. These practices were shared quietly among women, passed down as household wisdom. They were not written in medical texts, but they were repeated in kitchens and by firesides until they became part of ordinary care. The result was that infants experienced altered states from the very start of their lives. Their small bodies, fragile and easily overwhelmed, were drawn into long spells of heavy sleep that were not natural. Breathing slowed, eyes fluttered, and limbs grew limp. Mothers welcomed the silence. Fathers who needed rest for labor thanked God for a night without disturbance. What none of them understood was that the baby's body was being forced into submission by chemicals far too strong. Some survived and grew accustomed to it. Others did not wake, their deaths recorded as mysteries of nature. The trade in soothing syrups and powders grew steadily. Apothecaries sold mixtures designed specifically for infants. These were advertised as safe, carrying gentle names that suggested comfort. In reality, many were made with the same dangerous plants used in adult sedatives. The bottles were small and cheap, making them accessible to families of every class. A noble household might keep them beside perfumes and medicines, while a peasant mother might scrape coins together to buy a vial from the market. Both believed they were protecting their children. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like finding bottles of morphine syrup marketed for babies on the shelves of a pharmacy. The cultural acceptance of these methods is striking. Instead of seeing them as harmful, people praised them as responsible parenting. A quiet child was considered a healthy child. A family that managed to sleep through the night was thought fortunate. Neighbors sometimes traded advice on how much to use, comparing amounts as if they were recipes for bread. In this way, dangerous substances were normalized in the most intimate parts of life. The practice was not only about convenience, it was also tied to fear. Many parents believed that constant crying was a sign of evil spirits or curses. When a soothing drink silenced the child, they saw it as proof that the spirit had been driven away. The connection between sedatives and protection became deeply rooted in belief. Mothers did not feel guilty for using them. They felt relieved that they had defended their children from unseen dangers. The consequences, however, were long-lasting. Children who survived regular doses grew up in bodies shaped by early exposure. Some may have developed tolerances, needing stronger amounts to feel the same effect later. Others grew weak or sickly. Their systems strained before they had even walked. These outcomes were rarely connected to the soothing syrups. Parents blamed fate, curses, or poor luck, never guessing that the bottles on their shelves were responsible. I cannot help but think that if I were a parent in those times, exhausted and desperate, I might have done the same without realizing the cost. The social dimension of the practice is also important. Families that managed to keep their babies quiet were seen as orderly and blessed. Those whose infants cried through the night were pied or judged. The use of sedatives became not only a tool of survival, but also a marker of respectability. Mothers who resisted using them were sometimes pressured by others who could not understand why they endured constant crying. In this way, the practice spread further, reinforced by community expectations. Medical authorities of the time rarely condemned the habit. Physicians occasionally warned about overdosing, but they did not have the tools to measure or regulate. Most simply accepted that small amounts of sedatives were part of childcare. The church too paid little attention, focusing instead on spiritual dangers. The silence of authority allowed the practice to continue unchecked for centuries. The image of a medieval cradle tells the story well. Small wooden bed, a child wrapped in linen, a cloth dipped in bitter liquid tied nearby, and a mother working at the hearth, finally at peace. The scene looks ordinary, but it hides the reality of how substances entered life from the very beginning. Children grew up in societies where intoxication was not a distant vice, but a presence in their earliest memories. What began as a way to soothe babies shaped entire generations. It created a culture where chemical escape was seen as normal, where silence was valued more than safety. The babies who survived grew into adults who did not fear strong mixtures, because they had known them since before they could walk. In this sense, addiction truly began in the cradle. From these quiet nurseries, the story of intoxication carried upward into the lives of nobles, where even beauty became tied to dangerous substances, and women used deadly plants in pursuit of elegance that left them lost in visions. In the courts and palaces of medieval Europe, appearance carried immense weight. Noble women were judged not only for their family ties and wealth, but also for how they looked in public. Beauty was considered a sign of virtue, power, and refinement. Among the many strange methods used to enhance appearance, one stood out for both its danger and its effect: the use of belladonna. This plant, whose name means beautiful lady, was prized because a few drops of its extract in the eyes caused the pupils to dilate. Large dark pupils were seen as a mark of beauty, making the gaze appear soft and alluring. The danger hidden inside the practice was rarely spoken of. The substance came from deadly nightshade, a plant long feared for its poisonous qualities. Physicians and apothecaries knew that in high doses it could kill, but they also knew that in tiny amounts it changed how the eyes looked. Noble women, encouraged by advice and fashion, applied drops to their eyes before feasts, audiences, or dances. The effect was immediate. Their eyes appeared wider, their faces more striking in candlelight. Compliments followed, and the habit was reinforced. The risk of damage or death seemed distant compared to the reward of admiration. It is almost absurdly funny that admiration at a banquet was bought at the cost of blindness and delirium. The consequences of regular use soon became clear. Eyes that were forced to remain dilated struggled to see properly. A bright light caused pain. Reading became difficult, and simple tasks were overwhelming. Women reported dizziness, nausea, and confusion. After repeated applications, in some cases, they slipped into delirium, seeing things that were not there, stumbling through corridors or collapsing in their chambers. Servants whispered that their mistresses were cursed or touched by spirits. In reality, they were intoxicated by the very substance that was supposed to make them beautiful. Belladonna's effects were not confined to the eyes. Absorption through the delicate tissues spread into the bloodstream, carrying alkaloids that disrupted the nervous system. These chemicals created a state of dreamlike confusion. A woman might walk through her palace convinced she was somewhere else, or mistake shadows for figures. The mixture of wealth, isolation, and intoxication made their lives surreal. Nobles believed themselves above ordinary suffering, but in this case, their pursuit of beauty tied them directly to the same altered states experienced by peasants chewing toxic roots in desperation. The practice was more than vanity. In societies where women's power was often limited to influence and appearance, beauty was a form of survival. A woman who appeared desirable could secure alliances, strengthen her family standing, or keep her husband's attention. Belladonna was not just a cosmetic. It was a weapon in the competition of courtly life. The willingness to endure pain or confusion was seen as proof of dedication. Neighbors and rivals noticed the effect and sought the same, spreading the custom further among the elite. Chroniclers occasionally noted the strange behavior of noble women under the influence of belladonna. They described ladies wandering palaces as if lost, staring with glassy eyes or speaking nonsense. Instead of condemning them, many courtiers accepted these episodes as eccentricities of rank. The association between beauty and madness was rarely questioned. For those outside the court, such behavior became material for gossip, stories that blurred the line between elegance and folly. We compare it to modern times. It would be like fashion magazines encouraging people to take a dangerous drug for glossy eyes, and society praising them for following the trend. Physicians themselves contributed to the habit. Some recommended belladonna not only for cosmetics, but also for calming nerves or easing pain. In this way, women who began using it for beauty found more excuses to continue. What was once a ritual before feasts became a regular part of daily life? Bottles of extract appeared in chambers alongside perfumes and jewelry, treated as ordinary possessions. The boundary between medicine, poison, and cosmetics dissolved. The dangers, however, could not be hidden forever. Some women suffered permanent damage to their sight. Others endured long episodes of delirium that left them weak and disoriented. Families sometimes kept these outcomes secret, unwilling to admit that a pursuit of beauty had led to disaster. Still, the practice continued because the reward of admiration in public outweighed the hidden suffering in private. The symbolism of belladonna spread into culture. Paintings and poems celebrated women with wide, dark eyes, making them look desirable for generations. The plant itself, once feared, became associated with allure. It shows how intoxicants, when tied to fashion and social pressure, can reshape an entire culture's understanding of beauty. What began as a dangerous trick of appearance turned into a lasting standard. I cannot help but think that if I lived in such a world, I might have been tempted to, knowing that a single glance could change my standing at court. The image of a noble woman preparing for an evening at court captures the practice clearly. She sits before a polished mirror, a servant holding a small vial of extract. A drop falls into her eye, her pupils widen, and her gaze changes. The effect is admired by everyone around her. No one notices her dizziness, her unsteady movements, or the shadows flickering at the edge of her vision. She steps into the hall, admired by many, yet already lost in a dream that is part vision and part delirium. From the noble halls where beauty was enhanced with poison, the story of intoxication extended further into the lives of ordinary people who found themselves slipping into altered states, not through fashion, but through accident. When spoiled bread and infected grain turned their meals into unexpected trips into chaos. In the medieval kitchen, food was never wasted. Families worked hard to grow grain, raise animals, and store provisions for the winter. Every crumb mattered, and even when bread grew hard or meat showed signs of age, it was often still eaten. Preservation methods were limited. Salt, smoke, and air drying slowed decay, but they did not always prevent it. People consumed what they had, believing that hunger was a greater danger than rot. They did not realize that within their bread and meat invisible threats were waiting. Threats that could twist their minds as surely as any potion. One of the most dangerous culprits was ergot, a fungus that infected rye, a grain eaten widely across Europe. When ground into flour and baked into bread, the fungus produced compounds similar to what we now know as LSD. Villagers who consumed such bread had no idea that their daily meal was delivering powerful hallucinogens. After eating, they might feel tingling in their limbs, strange visions, or overwhelming fear. Some fell into uncontrollable fits of laughter or weeping. Others collapsed with convulsions. Whole communities were struck, their symptoms baffling both physicians and priests. It is almost comical that people thought they were cursed by demons when, in truth, they were poisoned by their dinner. The effects went beyond the individual. Cases of what later came to be called the dancing plague were likely linked to ergot poisoning. Groups of people would gather in public squares, moving, shaking, and dancing for hours or even days, unable to stop. Chroniclers described scenes of dozens, sometimes hundreds of villagers leaping, spinning, and collapsing in exhaustion. To their neighbors, it looked like possession or mass hysteria. In reality, it was the collective result of toxic bread, combined with the power of suggestion. The tragedy was that people suffered real injuries, breaking bones and tearing muscles, all because of a fungus that grew unnoticed in their fields. Spoiled meat could have similar effects. Without refrigeration, meat often went bad before it was finished. Families salted and smoked it, but mold still grew. Eating such food sometimes led not only to stomach pain, but also to fevers, delirium, and hallucinations. People who consumed it might rant, see visions, or lash out in confusion. Communities explain this as punishment from God, possession by spirits, or curses from neighbors. They lacked the understanding to see that it was the result of toxins. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like eating leftovers covered in mold and then ending up in the hospital with both food poisoning and psychedelic visions. The social response was shaped by fear. Villagers saw their neighbors behaving strangely and assumed dark forces were at work. Exorcisms were performed, prayers recited, and sometimes entire families were shunned. The link between food and madness was rarely made. Instead, the events fed into the wider belief in witchcraft and demonic presence. Inquisitors saw proof of evil where there was only disease. Many people suffered not only from the poisoning itself, but also from the suspicion and punishment that followed. The scale of outbreaks could be devastating. In years when ergot spread widely through fields, entire towns were affected. Some reports describe villages where dozens of people lay writhing in pain, their skin burning, their minds filled with visions. Others spoke of wandering bands of sufferers stumbling through countryside roads, convinced they were on holy journeys. The scenes were chaotic, frightening, and unforgettable. They left deep marks on collective memory, shaping stories of curses, saints, and devils. Families caught in these events did not understand what was happening. A mother might see her child convulsing after supper and run to the priest for help. A farmer might watch his wife laugh uncontrollably through the night and think she was bewitched. The randomness of the poison made it more terrifying. Some ate the bread and felt fine, while others collapsed. There was no pattern visible to medieval eyes. To them, it looked like the hand of fate. I cannot help but think that if I had lived then, I too would have believed the devil was near, when my neighbors began dancing uncontrollably in the square. The connection between ergot and visions explains many of the strange episodes recorded in chronicles. Stories of whole communities seeing saints in the sky or hearing voices during storms may well have been the result of tainted meals. The blurred line between faith and intoxication once again shaped medieval life. People thought they had witnessed miracles or curses when they were simply experiencing poisoning. The human mind, already primed by belief, interpreted the visions as proof of supernatural power. Despite the suffering, bread continued to be eaten without question. Hunger left no room for caution. Rye was a staple, and discarding it was unthinkable. Families stored grain in damp barns, unaware that they were inviting fungi to grow. By the time the flour was baked, the danger was hidden. The choice between eating and starving left little doubt. People ate and they endured the consequences. These episodes also reinforced the role of the church. Priests were called to explain the unexplainable. Their answers often turned toward sin, penance, and prayer. This deepened the belief that intoxication was spiritual in nature rather than chemical. Communities responded with fasting, pilgrimages, and offerings to saints. The true cause remained invisible, but the cultural structures around it grew stronger. The image of villagers gathered in a church after days of madness, praying for relief from demons that never existed, is powerful. Smoke from incense filled the air. Voices echoed and exhausted bodies lay on the floor. No one realized that the cause of their misery was sitting in their granaries and on their tables. The tragedy is clear, but so is the humanity. They did not have the tools to understand what we now know. They only had the language of faith and fear. From the poisoned meals of common villages, the story of intoxicants returned again to the chambers of physicians, where experiments with mixtures of opium, herbs, and alcohol created new dangers behind closed doors. In the medieval world, doctors held a position both respected and feared. They were educated men, often trained in universities or monasteries, who spoke in Latin and prescribed treatments that ordinary people could not understand. Their chambers were filled with shelves of jars, bundles of dried herbs, and bowls of powders. To patients and families, this seemed like the height of knowledge. Yet behind those closed doors, much of what happened was trial and error. Physicians mixed and tested combinations of substances without precise measures, hoping to ease pain or calm sickness. What they often created were mixtures that contained the very roots of addiction, though neither they nor their patients knew the word for it. Among the substances they used, opium stood out. Imported at a high price, it was prepared as resins, powders, or tinctures. When mixed with alcohol or honey, it becomes a powerful painkiller. Toa, we would call it morphine in crude form. For patients suffering from unbearable pain, it seemed like a miracle. A few sips could silence moans, relax tense muscles, and bring deep sleep. Families watched in relief as their loved ones finally rested. The physician gained praise, and the remedy was celebrated. It is almost ironic that men who warned against the dangers of excess wine were pouring their patients something far stronger without hesitation. The problem was that dosing was imprecise. Without scales accurate enough to measure tiny amounts, doctors relied on their eyes, hands, and experience. One might scrape a little too much resin into the cup. Another might dilute too little in the wine. Patients reacted differently depending on age, strength, and health. Some awoke, refreshed and calm. Others slipped into delirium or death. The inconsistency was hidden by the fact that everyone trusted the physician's authority. No one dared question whether the mixture was safe. Patients who survived often asked for the remedy again. A knight recovering from wounds might request more to dull the pain of his healing body. A noblewoman who found relief from sleepless nights would insist on another dose. Even peasants, if they could afford it, sought out doctors for the chance to experience the silence of opium-laced medicine. Slowly habits formed. People who once took the mixture only when sick began to crave it in ordinary times. They believed it was medicine. They did not recognize that their bodies were beginning to depend on it. Behind the physician's door, experiments grew more daring. Some mixed opium with henbane or mandrake, hoping to create stronger sedatives. Others added stimulants in the belief that balancing opposite effects would create harmony. The results were unpredictable. The patient might feel bursts of energy followed by sudden collapse. Another might see visions while his body lay motionless. Physicians recorded these reactions in notes, but the lessons were not always learned. The drive to try again outweighed caution. If we compare it to today, it would be like doctors handing out bottles of experimental drugs without trials, hoping for the best, and calling the disasters unfortunate accidents. The secrecy of the chamber added to the danger. Families rarely saw what went into the mixtures. They handed over money and trust, accepting whatever cup was returned. Some doctors guarded their recipes as personal treasures, convinced they had discovered secrets no one else could match. Others sold small vials for extra profit, letting substances slip into the wider community. The lack of oversight meant that practices varied wildly from one town to the next. What one physician called a cure, another might condemn as reckless. Patients themselves bore the cost. A man treated for pain might find himself unable to sleep without the same mixture. A woman calmed by drops of tincture might grow restless until she received more. The idea of dependence was not part of the medieval vocabulary. Instead, they described such people as weak or fragile. Addiction hid in plain sight because it looked like an illness. Families believed their loved ones were cursed with frail bodies, never realizing that the medicine itself was shaping the weakness. I cannot help but think that if I were sick in that world, I too would have begged for another sip, never questioning why life felt harder without it. Physicians themselves sometimes fell victim. Working daily with these substances, they tasted and tested their preparations. Some grew accustomed to drinking small amounts, convincing themselves it sharpened their thoughts or kept them calm. Over time, they too showed signs of dependence, though their status protected them from criticism. A sick peasant was judged weak. A physician under the same influence was considered eccentric but wise. The double standard allowed the cycle to continue without challenge. The reputation of physicians as gatekeepers of secret knowledge ensured that their experiments spread across Europe. Students trained in one city carried recipes to another. Monks copied notes and passed them into libraries. By the late Middle Ages, mixtures of opium, alcohol, and herbs were known in every region. They became the standard answer to pain, sleeplessness, and agitation. No one questioned whether these remedies were worse than the illnesses they treated. The authority of doctors silenced doubts. Image of a physician's chamber captures the atmosphere. A patient lies weak on a wooden bed. The doctor bends over a small cup, stirring powders into dark liquid. Shelves behind him are lined with jars, none labeled in ways the family can understand. He hands the cup to the patient, who drinks and sinks into quiet. The family whispers prayers of thanks, never knowing whether the peace will last an hour or forever. The door closes, and the process repeats for the next visitor. This hidden world shaped medieval attitudes toward intoxication in subtle ways. People grew used to the idea that relief came in liquid form, that strong medicine was both a blessing and a curse. They did not see the line between healing and harm. In their desperation, they trusted the man behind the door. The trust was often misplaced, but it sustained the practice for centuries. From these chambers of experimentation, the story of intoxication spread again, this time beyond medicine, into the pilgrimages and journeys where hunger, exhaustion, and long marches created visions of their own without the need for bottles or powders. In the medieval world, faith was a powerful force. People believed that suffering could bring them closer to God. Fasting, long journeys, and self-denial were seen as acts of devotion. Pilgrims set out on foot to visit holy sites, often walking hundreds of kilometers. They carried little food, slept in fields or barns, and spent their days in prayer and hardship. The goal was to cleanse the soul, to seek forgiveness, and to feel the presence of the divine. What many did not realize was that their extreme conditions were altering their minds and bodies in ways that produced visions, sounds, and feelings that felt holy, but were rooted in exhaustion. The journey of a pilgrim was not easy. Roads were rough, the weather was harsh, and shelter was rare. Many walked barefoot or with worn shoes. They ate only what they could beg or find, often going days with little more than a crust of bread. Water was not always clean, and sleep came in short, uncomfortable bursts. The body, deprived of food and rest, began to weaken. Muscles ached, eyes blurred, and thoughts became slow or scattered. The constant repetition of prayers and chants combined with physical strain created a rhythm that could lull the mind into altered states. It is almost strange that what some called a miracle was often just the body crying out in confusion from hunger and fatigue. As the days turned into weeks, pilgrims reported seeing lights, hearing voices, or feeling the presence of saints. They believed these were signs of divine favor. Some claimed to have spoken with angels or to have received visions of heaven. Others felt overwhelming peace or joy in moments when their strength was nearly gone. These experiences were celebrated as spiritual achievements. Families back home took pride in relatives who returned with stories of sacred encounters. The truth, however, was more complex. The combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations in anyone. The church encouraged fasting as a way to show devotion. Saints were praised for surviving on little more than water for weeks. Monks and nuns followed strict diets, believing that denying the body strengthened the soul. In such environments, visions were common. People believed they were seeing the divine, when in fact they were experiencing the effects of a starving brain. The body, when pushed to the edge, releases chemicals that can create vivid images and sounds. The line between faith and biology blurred. Pilgrims often traveled in groups, and shared experiences reinforced belief. When one person claimed to see a light or hear a voice, others became more likely to notice similar sensations. The power of suggestion was strong. In moments of shared hardship, the mind looked for meaning. A shadow in the trees became a sign. A gust of wind felt like a message. The environment combined with physical weakness made every small event feel significant. If we compare it to today, it would be like hiking for days without food or sleep and mistaking a flickering flashlight for a holy vision. The path to holy sites was lined with shrines and relics. Pilgrims touched stones, kissed statues, and prayed at altars believed to hold special power. These rituals, performed in a state of physical depletion, often triggered intense emotional responses. Tears flowed easily and feelings of awe or fear were magnified. The journey itself became a test of endurance, and those who completed it felt transformed. In reality, their bodies had been through severe stress, and their minds had adapted by producing altered states to cope. Some pilgrims never returned. The journey claimed many lives. Starvation, disease, and exposure took their toll. Those who died were often seen as martyrs, their deaths interpreted as signs of holiness. Others returned home with lasting effects. Some remained weak or ill for months. Others spoke of their visions for the rest of their lives, convinced they had touched the divine. Their communities treated them with reverence, and their stories spread, inspiring more journeys. The image of a pilgrim kneeling before a shrine, eyes wide with wonder, body trembling from weakness, captures the essence of these experiences. They were caught between faith and survival, seeking meaning in every moment of suffering. The journey was both a physical and spiritual ordeal, and the line between the two was often invisible. Not all who undertook these journeys did so willingly. Some were sent as penance, ordered by priests or lords to walk to a holy site as punishment for sins. These pilgrims carried guilt as well as hunger. Their visions were often darker, filled with fear or sorrow. The lack of food and rest amplified these emotions, creating powerful experiences that felt like punishment from above. Despite the dangers, pilgrimage remained popular. It was seen as a way to earn grace, to cleanse the soul, and to prove devotion. The stories of visions and miracles encouraged more people to undertake the journey. The connection between suffering and holiness was deeply ingrained. Few questioned whether the visions were real or the result of physical collapse. Experiences were too powerful, too meaningful to dismiss. I cannot help but think that in such a world I too might have mistaken the dizziness of hunger for the touch of the divine. The tradition of fasting and pilgrimage shaped medieval culture. It reinforced the belief that the body was a vessel to be disciplined, that pain could lead to enlightenment. The experiences of pilgrims fed into the broader understanding of how humans could connect with the divine. The fact that many of these experiences were induced by physical hardship did not diminish their impact. They were woven into the fabric of faith. From the roads of pilgrimage, the story of altered states moved into the realm of nature, where villagers believed that certain trees and plants spoke in the night, their mysterious properties causing more unintentional journeys into the unknown. In the countryside of medieval Europe, life was surrounded by forests, groves, and hedges. People depended on wood for fires, shelter, and tools. But they also feared the hidden dangers of certain trees and plants. Knowledge of herbs was passed down carefully, yet mistakes were common. Some plants carried toxins that affected the mind and body in ways no one could predict. When these effects appeared, villagers often explained them through stories and legends. They believed that trees could whisper, that branches moved with intention, and that plants carried voices in the night, what modern science would call poisoning. They called enchantment. Among the most feared and revered trees was the yew. Its dark needles and red berries were common in churchyards where people said the roots fed on the dead. Small amounts of its poison could cause dizziness, confusion, or even visions before death. Villagers who handled or accidentally consumed parts of the tree sometimes stumbled, spoke strangely, or claimed to hear voices. The yew's reputation grew, and it was said that under the moon its branches whispered secrets. It is almost funny that people thought the tree was speaking when in reality their stomachs were twisting with toxins. Mistletoe growing high in oak trees carried its mysteries. Druids of earlier centuries had gathered it for rituals, and echoes of that respect lingered. When swallowed in certain forms, it could cause mild hallucinations, nausea, and a dreamlike state. Stories spread of villagers who ate berries by mistake and then wandered through the night, convinced that the forest itself was alive with voices. For a people already living in a world full of spirits and signs, the line between sickness and vision was thin. Other shrubs and plants like thorn apple or wild herbs with alkaloids added to the confusion. Children might chew leaves out of curiosity, or herders might see animals fall ill after grazing. When humans experience strange effects such as hearing whispers or seeing shadows move, the belief that plants themselves were speaking grew stronger. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like someone eating unwashed wild mushrooms, becoming delirious, and then insisting that the park trees were sending them messages. These stories spread quickly. Villagers gathered around fires to repeat tales of men who heard warnings from trees or women who claimed that branches spoke their names. Over time, such stories turned into tradition. Certain groves were avoided at night. People said that during the full moon, voices would rise from the leaves. What began as isolated incidents of poisoning became part of folklore. Fear of the natural world blended with respect, shaping how communities treated forests. The church often tried to combat these beliefs, labeling them superstition or even heresy. Priests preached that voices in the night came from demons, not trees. Yet even within the churchyard, youths stood tall, symbols of both death and protection. Their presence reinforced the old beliefs. Villagers, torn between sermons and their own experiences, often held both views at once. They feared the devil, but they also believed the forest could speak. For many, the experiences were deeply real. A farmer returning late might feel weak after chewing a handful of strange berries, dizzy and unsteady, could swear the branches above were whispering. A child, after nibbling plants while playing, might return home describing songs from the hedge. Families unsure what to believe accepted these tales as warnings. They concluded that the trees themselves carried voices teaching humans to respect them. I cannot help but think that, in a silent medieval night, hearing a child swear that a tree spoke would have been convincing, even if I now know it was the effect of poison. The cultural impact of these beliefs was lasting. Certain trees became markers of mystery. Couples avoided them. Children were told not to play near them, and travelers carried charms when passing by. The forest was never just wood and leaves. It was alive with presence. Sometimes protective, sometimes threatening. Even when practical knowledge of poisonous plants existed, it was never separated from legend. A healer might say that you caused illness, but a storyteller would insist it carried voices. The image of a medieval village at the edge of a forest captures the tension. Houses stood close together, their windows glowing faintly with firelight. Beyond the fields, the dark mass of trees stretched into the horizon. At night, when the wind blew through branches, it sounded like whispers. For people already primed by stories and occasional poisonings, this was proof that the trees spoke. Their daily lives reinforced the belief that nature was not silent, and that plants themselves carried secrets. Such beliefs also shaped how justice was carried out. When someone fell ill after eating unknown plants, neighbors might accuse witches of teaching the trees to curse. Trials sometimes included testimony about voices in the night. The boundary between natural poisoning and supernatural accusation blurred. Entire communities could become caught up in fear of trees, witches, and unseen powers. The fascination with plants as speaking beings shows how intoxication was woven into everyday life. People did not need bottles or mixtures to experience altered states. The land itself, through accidents of eating or handling, provided moments that convinced them of other worlds. These were not deliberate highs, but they carried the same impact. People walked away changed, telling stories that lasted for generations. From the whispers of trees and bushes, the story of intoxication flowed back into the dark world of witchcraft, where ointments and hallucinogenic herbs created visions that became part of trials and fears across Europe. Not every strange vision in medieval Europe came from prayer or hunger. Some were linked directly to the use of plants prepared in ways ordinary people did not see. Women who lived on the margins of society, known as healers, midwives, or simply accused of witchcraft, often worked with herbs that had strong effects on the body and the mind. Their knowledge of roots and leaves was practical, but when used in high amounts, the results looked like enchantment. The image of witches flying through the night on broomsticks came not from the sky, but from the ointments they applied to their skin. The mixtures were made with plants such as belladonna, henbane, and aconite. Each of these contained alkaloids that could change perception, slow breathing, and create vivid hallucinations, combined into thick ointments. They were spread on the skin, sometimes on sensitive areas where absorption was faster. Within moments, the user felt detached from her body. Limbs grew light, sounds became distorted, and visions appeared. It is almost darkly funny that what neighbors swore was proof of witchcraft was often just the side effect of rubbing poison on the skin. The hallucinations were intense. Women described floating, flying, or leaving their bodies. Some believed they were traveling to gatherings in the forest, meeting spirits, or joining in secret feasts. To those who listened later, these stories confirmed the worst fears of witchcraft. In reality, the women were caught in dreams triggered by chemicals. Their minds stitched together familiar images, fields, animals, people into wild scenes. The sensation of flight was especially common, which explains the enduring image of witches soaring on broomsticks. The broom itself had a practical role. Ointments were sometimes applied using a handle or stick rubbed onto the body. Over time, this method became exaggerated into the tale of women mounting broomsticks and flying away. The misunderstanding grew into a cultural symbol repeated in stories, artwork, and eventually trials. What had started as a private ritual with herbs became the centerpiece of fear across entire communities. The side effects were not always pleasant. Along with visions came dry mouth, rapid heartbeat, and confusion. Some women grew weak or collapsed. Others rambled nonsense, their words taken as spells. Families who saw these episodes were frightened. They described women thrashing, sweating, and muttering in strange tones. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like confusing someone in a drug-induced hallucination for a person practicing black magic. When witchcraft trials spread across Europe, these experiences became evidence. Women accused of flying, attending Sabbaths, or summoning spirits often described their visions under interrogation. Judges and scribes recorded the details, noting the sensations of flight. The meetings with strange figures and the feasts in distant places. For them, the testimony was confirmation of guilt. They did not realize that the women were recounting drug-induced dreams, not real events. The lack of scientific knowledge turned hallucinations into crimes. Communities reinforced the fear. Villagers whispered of lights in the forest or shadows passing overhead, linking them to stories of witches. Every unexplained sickness, every strange event could be tied back to the image of women riding through the night. The fear was powerful enough to justify executions. Lives were ended because visions were mistaken for proof of supernatural power. I cannot help but think that if I had lived, then hearing my neighbor describe flying through the sky, I too might have believed it was real. While the ointments themselves were not always intended for pleasure, many women used them as medicine, trying to calm pain, ease childbirth, or relieve insomnia. The same plants that soothed in small doses became hallucinogenic in larger amounts. Without precise knowledge of dosage, accidents were frequent. What began as an attempt to heal turned into a journey into visions. The line between healer and witch blurred, depending less on the act itself and more on how the community interpreted it. The church's response was uncompromising. Authorities declared that such practices were the devil's work no matter the cause. Herbal knowledge that had once been tolerated was recast as sorcery. Women who experimented with ointments were no longer seen as caregivers, but as servants of darkness. Trials often highlighted the visions produced by these mixtures as undeniable evidence. The testimonies, though rooted in biology, were used to condemn. The atmosphere of fear silenced discussion of the true effects of plants. Instead of careful study, the knowledge retreated underground, carried by those still willing to risk it. Stories of witches flying persisted, reinforcing superstition rather than encouraging understanding. The true cause, hallucinogenic plants absorbed through the skin, remained hidden for centuries. The image of a medieval woman alone in her home, mixing herbs by candlelight, speaks to the reality. She rubs ointment on her body, closes her eyes, and soon feels as though she is rising above her house. Outside, the night is quiet, but in her mind, she is flying across fields and forests. Her neighbors, watching her strange behavior the next day, whispered that she must be a witch. The story grows, and before long it becomes proof of the supernatural. This blending of poison, medicine, and legend shows how deeply intoxication shaped culture. The hallucinations of a few became the fears of many. The use of herbs for healing was overshadowed by the terror of witches. What should have been understood as biology was recorded as sorcery. From these night visions, the story of intoxication turned again to religion, where possession and the arrival of spirits were often tied not to faith alone, but to the same strange reactions of the body when pushed beyond its limits. In many medieval villages, crowds sometimes gathered to witness what they believed was the presence of a saint or spirit entering a person's body. The event, often called possession or holy visitation, was seen as proof that the divine touched human lives directly. People would watch as a man or woman shouted loudly, fell into convulsions, or moved in wild dances that seemed beyond control. These behaviors were frightening but also fascinating. For some, they were signs of holiness. For others, there were reasons for fear and suspicion. What no one understood was that many of these episodes may have been the result of intoxication, poisoning, or the reaction of the body to certain substances. The triggers were varied. In some cases, people had been exposed to herbs or incense burned in large amounts during rituals. In others, they had consumed food or drink tainted with toxic plants or fungi. The effects were unpredictable. One person might tremble and collapse. Another might shout that they saw visions of saints or demons. Communities interpreted these responses according to their beliefs. For a deeply religious society, the natural explanation of poisoning was invisible. What they saw instead was the hand of God or the interference of the devil. It is almost amusing that a spoiled meal could be mistaken for proof of divine power. The behavior of those said to be possessed was dramatic. They cried out in strange voices, their bodies shook, and they sometimes spoke words they did not seem to know. People recorded accounts of individuals leaping, rolling on the ground, or running until they collapsed. Priests were summoned to perform prayers or exorcisms, convinced they were driving out demons. Families stood by in fear, torn between pride that their relative had been chosen and shame that they were marked as different. The intensity of these events made them memorable, ensuring that stories spread far beyond the village where they happened. Communities responded in different ways. Some welcomed the possessed as holy, listening carefully to every word they spoke. Others kept their distance, convinced that the person was dangerous. Fear and reverence mixed uneasily. The same person could be praised in one moment and isolated in another. For many, the safest answer was to remove the individual from ordinary life until the episode passed. In this way, possession became not only a spiritual matter, but also a form of social control. The role of the church was central. Priests framed possession as either a blessing or a curse. If the person's vision spoke of saints, miracles, or virtue, they were accepted as divine. If the words were confusing, angry, or unsettling, the church declared them the work of demons. Few considered the possibility that toxins in food or smoke could produce the same symptoms. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like mistaking someone having a seizure from food poisoning for a prophet speaking on behalf of heaven. In many cases, possession episodes followed group rituals. Long hours of fasting, chanting, or exposure to incense prepared the body for collapse. When one person fell into trances, others often followed. The power of suggestion made whole groups believe they were touched by the divine. What began as exhaustion or intoxication spread into mass hysteria. Chroniclers described entire gatherings swaying, shouting, and dancing until exhaustion overtook them. To the outside world, it looked like a miracle. To the participants, it felt real. The personal experience of possession was intense. Those who later recalled the events described feelings of heat, rushing energy, and visions of light or figures. Some believed they had spoken with angels, others that they had been tested by devils. The emotional impact was lasting. People remembered these visions for years, treating them as the most important moments of their lives. It gave shape to their faith and justified their suffering. I cannot help but think that in such a society, if my body shook and my mind saw visions after fasting, I too would have believed that a saint had touched me. Possession also carried consequences. Some individuals gained reputations as holy figures and were sought for advice or blessings. Others were shunned, avoided as cursed or dangerous. In trials of witchcraft, accusations of possession were common. Those who displayed uncontrolled movements or visions risked being condemned. The thin line between holy experience and dangerous sorcery left people vulnerable. What one community saw as divine, another saw as evil. The imagery of these events was powerful. A crowded church filled with incense smoke, a young woman crying out in strange tones, villagers clutching rosaries in fear. The priest raises his voice in prayer while the congregation watches, half believing they are witnessing a miracle and half fearing they are in the presence of demons. Outside, the air is calm, but inside the church, the atmosphere is charged with tension. This mixture of belief, fear, and physical reaction created experiences that shaped entire communities. Possession episodes reinforced the medieval conviction that the divine and the demonic walked closely among them. They also demonstrated how little distinction people made between biology and faith. What was in fact poisoning, exhaustion, or intoxication became proof of spiritual presence. The stories written and retold carried this belief across generations. People remembered not the cause, but the awe and terror of the event itself. From these trances in village squares and churches, the story of intoxication turned back toward rituals of the church, where even sacred wine itself sometimes led to unexpected states of drunkenness during holy ceremonies. In medieval Europe, wine had a meaning far greater than refreshment. It was central to worship, considered the blood of Christ, lifted at the altar and shared among believers during communion. The drink was holy, a sacred element meant to unite the faithful in devotion. Yet behind the symbolism, wine was still wine. It carried alcohol, it warmed the body, and it dulled the mind if consumed in excess, because it was woven into religious practice. Opportunities for indulgence appeared often. Priests and congregants alike found themselves drinking more than the ritual required, and the result was that drunkenness sometimes settled over the very place that was supposed to be most solemn. The supply of wine in churches was steady. Monasteries grew grapes on their lands, pressing and storing barrels for both daily consumption and ritual use. Merchants brought casks to towns, and donations from wealthy patrons ensured that most churches were rarely without stock. Wine was safer to drink than much of the water available, and it was consumed in monasteries as part of meals. When it appeared at Mass, no one hesitated to drink deeply. It is almost comical that what was meant as a token sip of divine blood often turned into a round of generous drinking more suited to a banquet hall than a church. The chalice itself encouraged overindulgence, passed along a row, carried more wine than one mouthful. Each person drank and then gave it to the next. A priest, seeing plenty left, might offer again. In wealthier churches, several chalices were used, and the supply seemed endless. Records survive of masses where congregants left staggering, their chants dissolving into laughter or quarrels. Priests, too, sometimes failed to control themselves. Chronicles tell of slurred prayers, clumsy gestures, and even accidents at the altar. To the outside observer, it must have seemed like worship had lost its dignity. To the participants, however, such scenes were not unusual. Alcohol was part of everyday life, and the church was no exception. Part of the explanation lies in how medieval people viewed wine. This was a staple as ordinary as bread, taken at meals, used in medicine, and offered to guests. Wine touched every part of life. The idea that it could be harmful when consumed freely was not strongly developed. For many, the effects of drunkenness were temporary inconveniences, not warnings of deeper dangers. Priests reflected this same view. They saw no conflict between preaching discipline and pouring themselves a heavy portion from the chalice. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like walking into a church service and finding that communion was poured like an open bar, with no one thinking it unusual. The church hierarchy did notice. Council sometimes issued reminders that priests should remain sober at Mass. Bishops scolded clergy who gained reputations for excess. Some letters mentioned the shame of seeing priests unsteady at the altar. Yet these warnings rarely led to change. Wine was too essential, and moderation was too hard to enforce. A stern word from above did little against centuries of habit. Parishioners expected wine at Mass, and priests relied on it both in ritual and in daily life. The scenes inside the church were layered. Imagine a stone nave filled with flickering candles, The smell of incense mixes with the sharp scent of wine. Voices chant, rising and falling until the chalice comes forward. A line of people drinks, some in quiet reverence, others taking long sips. The priest, already flushed, lifts his voice louder than before. By the time the service ends, many leave with heads light, steps uneven, and hearts convinced they have touched the holy mystery. Whether the warmth they felt came from God or from alcohol was not a question they asked. The practice cut across classes. Nobles drank as much as peasants, and both shared in communion. For the wealthy, indulgence was a mark of generosity. Taking more showed status, as if God's gift flowed more freely for them. Priests, dependent on noble favor, rarely objected. Poorer congregants followed the example, convinced that abundance was part of the blessing. No one wished to be the one who refused what was offered at the altar. The social pressure to drink reinforced the ritual until moderation was nearly impossible. Over time, repeated indulgence-shaped habits. Priests accustomed to drinking heavily during Mass often continued after the service. Some became dependent, though medieval society lacked the language to describe addiction. Instead, such men were labeled weak or simply fond of wine. Congregations forgave them, sometimes even admired their vigor. The notion that drunkenness in church might be shameful did not outweigh the acceptance of alcohol in ordinary life. I cannot help but think that if I had lived then, I too would have accepted a heavy chalice without hesitation, because everyone else around me would be doing the same. The blending of sacred meaning and physical intoxication reveals much about medieval culture. Faith was not separate from the senses. A drink could be holy and intoxicating at once, and the overlap was rarely questioned. People did not analyze where the ritual ended and excess began. They trusted the framework of the Mass, and whatever happened within it was accepted as part of God's design. The idea that alcohol could disrupt worship seemed minor compared to the conviction that communion itself was sacred. Outside the church, the same pattern appeared. Festivals, weddings, and markets were fueled by wine. To step into the church and drink during Mass was simply another part of the rhythm of life. It did not feel like abuse to them. It felt like continuity. What mattered was not the amount consumed, but the act of participation. To share the chalice was to share in the community, no matter how much was swallowed. The image of drunken worship stayed with observers. Travelers sometimes mocked it, writing that certain towns seemed more like taverns than houses of God. Reformers complained that the sanctity of the Mass was weakened by priests who could not stand straight. Yet for ordinary people, the ceremony retained its power. They left the church believing they had joined with God, even if their steps faltered on the way home. The strength of ritual masked the weakness of human indulgence from these blurred lines between prayer and intoxication. The story of altered states moved on to those who claimed visions of the future. These visionaries were respected and feared, praised for their insight. Yet often they too were shaped not only by faith but by substances that changed the way they saw the world. Some people in the Middle Ages wrote down what they believed were visions of the future. They claimed to see images of cities burning, armies marching, or disasters that had not yet happened. Their words carried weight because others were eager to believe that the divine could speak through chosen individuals. Monks copied these accounts, and villagers repeated them with awe. The boundary between imagination, altered perception, and genuine belief in prophecy was thin. What we now suspect may have been hallucinations or the effects of substances was taken then as revelation. The settings varied. Sometimes the visionary was a monk who had spent weeks in fasting and prayer, weakened by hunger and long nights without sleep. Sometimes it was a lay person, someone in the village who, after an illness or strange dream, claimed to see the shape of coming days. Other times it was connected to herbs or drinks that dulled the senses and created shifting lights in the mind. However it began, the words of visionaries spread quickly. They were copied in manuscripts and told in sermons. People wanted guidance, and visions provided it. It is almost amusing that a half-saint starved monk describing fire in the sky could be treated as more reliable than the steady observations of healthy men. The visions themselves were dramatic. Some described floods and plagues. Others claimed to see saints walking among men, offering warnings or comfort. A few wrote of battles long before. They happened, leading later generations to believe they had foretold history. Details often blurred, yet enough seemed to match real events that faith in visionaries grew stronger. No one questioned whether their minds had been altered by exhaustion, poisoning, or strong incense inhaled during hours of prayer. To the faithful, the visions were holy. The church had mixed feelings about visionaries. On one hand, prophecies that supported the teachings of the church were welcomed. They reinforced belief, inspired obedience, and reminded people of divine power. On the other hand, visions that challenged authority or suggested new revelations were treated with suspicion. Some visionaries were praised as saints, others condemned as heretics. The difference often depended less on what they experienced and more on how their words fit the needs of those in power. Among villagers, the response was less formal but equally intense. A farmer who predicted a bad harvest might become both feared and respected. A woman who said she saw death approaching could be avoided or seek advice. Communities did not separate spiritual experience from ordinary life. If someone claimed to see the future, people listened. The possibility of divine warning was too important to ignore. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like treating the dreams of a sleep-deprived patient on heavy medication as national predictions printed in newspapers. The causes of these visions can be understood more clearly today. Long fasting reduces energy and alters brain chemistry. Lack of sleep produces hallucinations. Exposure to mold on bread or ergot on rye can cause vivid sights and strange thoughts. Herbal mixtures, whether taken as medicine or ritual, introduced alkaloids that distorted perception. In every case, the human body responded with confusion. But in the Middle Ages, confusion was mistaken for prophecy. People did not see biology. They saw the hand of God. These visionaries often lived with the weight of their own experiences. Some believed completely in what they had seen, convinced they were chosen. Others doubted, torn between fear and pride. A few wrote with humility, saying they did not know if the visions were from heaven or their weakness. Yet once the story spread, the question no longer mattered. Communities took the words and gave them power. The image of a visionary is not one of glamour, but of frailty. Thin from hunger, pale from nights of wakefulness, eyes staring into the distance, the visionary mutters about storms, armies, or fire. Listeners gather, uneasy but eager, trying to decide whether these words are warnings. For them, the risk of ignoring prophecy was too high. Even if the source was uncertain, the message was treated with seriousness. Social impact was real. Visionaries influenced decisions, inspired fear, and shaped the mood of communities. Leaders used their words to rally support or to frighten people into obedience. Ordinary villagers adjusted their lives, planting differently, storing food, or preparing for war. A single vision, written or spoken, could ripple through entire regions. The authority given to these experiences shows how much people trusted the unseen. At the same time, not all visionaries were celebrated. Some were mocked, ignored, or punished. When predictions failed, communities grew angry. When visions conflicted with church teaching, they were denounced. The fragile line between saint and madman was crossed often, and people lived or died depending on how their visions were received. The persistence of visionary accounts tells us how normal altered states were in the medieval mind. No one expected clear divisions between faith, sickness, and intoxication. Dream could be holy, a seizure could be a message, and a hallucination could be prophecy. In such a world, visionaries held a special place. They were both feared and needed. Their words filled the silence of uncertainty with meaning. I cannot help but think that if I had lived then, hearing a gaunt figure speak of storms and war with a trembling voice, I too would have believed, because it would have matched the fears already in my mind. The acceptance of such visions shows how society turned weakness into authority. The altered body, whether by choice or accident, became the vessel of divine words. From these individuals who saw the future in hunger and poison, the story of intoxication returned once more to the space of ritual, where even the simple act of burning resins and inhaling smoke became enough to send whole gatherings into light trances. Inside the stone walls of medieval churches, smoke was as common as candlelight. Services were filled with the smell of burning resins such as frankincense, myrrh, and galbanum. The purpose was ritual, meant to honor God and lift prayers upward. But the effect on the body was more direct than many realized. In closed spaces where windows were small and air circulation was weak, the smoke grew thick. Priests, attendants, and congregants all breathed it deeply. Over long hours, the subtle influence of the resins touched their minds and bodies, creating sensations they did not question. The smoke had different effects, depending on the amount and the type of resin used. Frankincense was prized for its sharp, almost citrus-like scent. Myrrh carried a heavier, earthy aroma. Galbanum added a sharp rhinous edge. When burned together in large amounts, they created clouds that lingered in the nave of the church. People inhaled without choice, and after time they felt changes. Some grew calm, others drowsy, and a few reported feelings of lightness or strange clarity. It is almost amusing that what was intended as a holy fragrance sometimes acted more like a mild drug shared by an entire congregation. Priests encouraged the use of incense because it elevated the ceremony. The sight of smoke rising made worship feel sacred, mysterious, and removed from daily life. The smell marked the church as holy ground. Yet neither priests nor congregants recognized that they were also exposing themselves to chemicals that altered mood and perception. Prolonged inhalation in closed spaces created mild intoxication. People felt moved, touched, or overwhelmed. They thought it was the presence of God. The scenes described by chroniclers are vivid. A church filled with chanting, the air heavy with smoke, and the light of candles flickering through the haze. Congregants swayed as they prayed, voices blending into a slow rhythm. Some cried openly, convinced they were touched by divine power. Others reported visions of light or warmth flooding their bodies. These experiences became proof of holiness, but they were also natural responses to hours of breathing incense in crowded halls. The physical effects were not always gentle. Some people fainted, overcome by the density of the smoke. Others left with headaches, coughing, or watery eyes. But because the practice was religious, no one questioned it. Suffering in church was seen as part of devotion. A fainting congregant was described as blessed, not poisoned. The smoke itself was sacred, and its power, whether uplifting or overwhelming, was framed as divine will. If we compare it to today, it would be like filling a modern church with enough scented candles to make everyone lighted it, and then calling the dizziness a miracle. Resins were not limited to churches. Wealthy households burned them during private devotions. Nobles used them to mark celebrations or funerals. The thick scent symbolized wealth and piety, since resins were imported and costly. Servants who tended the fires often spent hours in smoke-filled rooms. They too experienced the effects, though without the same sense of holiness attached. For them, it was simply part of the air they breathed while working. The trade in resins was wide. Boswellia trees grew in Arabia and Africa. Myrrh came from the Horn of Africa and galbanum from the Middle East. Merchants carried them across deserts and seas, selling them at high prices in European markets. Churches invested heavily, believing incense essential to proper worship. The expense reinforced the belief in its holiness. Something so costly could not be questioned. To breathe it was to share in the wealth of heaven. The role of incense in shaping religious experience cannot be overstated. Congregants associated the scent with sacredness. Even outside of church, the smell could trigger feelings of reverence. The human brain linked the fragrance to worship and the sensations that followed. Over time, the smoke itself became a pathway to altered states. The faithful did not seek intoxication, but they found it nonetheless. Some records describe individuals entering states of ecstasy during long ceremonies. They spoke of visions, of hearing voices, or of being lifted outside themselves. Priests praised these as moments of divine grace. The possibility that chemicals in the smoke played a role was never considered. In a world where everything was explained through God or the devil, biology had no voice. The faithful accepted what they felt as proof of their closeness to heaven. Overindulgence in incense also fueled suspicion in trials of heresy or witchcraft. Accusations sometimes included the use of strange smoke. Villagers who saw outsiders burning herbs might believe they were summoning spirits. What was normal in church became suspicious in fields or homes. The line between holy incense and forbidden fumigation was thin, shaped not by substance, but by context. I cannot help but think that if I had lived then standing in a smoke-filled church for hours, I too would have felt that God was near. Even though now I understand it was my body reacting to the air I breathed, the experience must have been powerful, binding entire communities together in a shared state of mind. The image of a medieval service thick with smoke reveals how collective intoxication worked. No one drank or swallowed anything. No ointments or herbs were applied directly. Instead, the very air carried the influence. Everyone shared it equally, from the priest at the altar to the servant at the back. This equality reinforced its acceptance. No one could deny what they had felt when the smoke was heavy. The legacy of incense use endures. Even today, many churches still burn resins, though in smaller amounts and better ventilated spaces. The connection between scent and spirituality remains strong. Modern science has shown that compounds in frankincense can affect mood, reduce anxiety, and even influence brain activity. What medieval people accepted as a mystery, we can now trace in chemistry. Yet the effect is not so different. The faithful still breathe, still feel calmer, and still associate the experience with the sacred. From these shared clouds of smoke, the story of intoxication returned to smaller bottles and secret mixtures. Where love potions promised passion and desire, leaving people uncertain whether they were truly enchanted or simply under the influence of another form of drug. Among the many bottles sold in medieval markets, few carried more promise than the so-called love potions. These mixtures were advertised as ways to win affection, to inspire passion, or to bind a partner forever. They were sold by wandering healers, local herbalists, and sometimes by people with no skill other than the ability to persuade. Buyers ranged from young women hoping to attract a husband to older men anxious to secure loyalty. The idea that love could be poured into a cup was appealing in a world where marriages were often arranged and personal desire had little place. The contents of these bottles varied. Some contained simple herbs mixed with wine or honey. Others carried stronger substances, including mild sedatives or narcotics that produced dizziness, warmth, or sudden affection toward whoever offered the drink. A person who consumed such a potion might feel lightheaded, their heart racing, their senses dulled. To observers, this looked like love taking hold. To the person affected, the sensation was confusing but often pleasant. It is almost amusing that stumbling from a poorly measured narcotic was mistaken for falling deeply in love. Vendors of these potions relied on secrecy. They rarely shared the recipe, claiming it was ancient knowledge or a gift from spirits. Buyers did not ask questions. Mystery added to the allure. A small vial could be sold at a high price, promising results that ordinary words or gifts could not achieve. The exchange was quiet, hidden from priests who warned against such practices, but common enough that records mentioned love potions across Europe. The effects were unpredictable. In small doses, a potion might only cause mild relaxation, lowering resistance and making conversation feel easier. In larger amounts, it could produce strong drowsiness, confusion, or even unconsciousness. Some cases ended in tragedy when the recipient collapsed or failed to wake. Communities whispered of sudden deaths, but blame was often placed on fate, illness, or hidden sin, not on the potion itself. Sellers rarely faced punishment. Buyers often stayed silent out of embarrassment or fear. The social role of these potions was significant. They gave people a sense of control in relationships that were otherwise dictated by family or society. A woman with little say in who she married might still try to shape affection with a secret drink. A man without charm or wealth might hope a potion would win him favor. In both cases, the desire for agency outweighed the risk. The belief in the power of potions was stronger than the evidence of their danger. Priests and authorities condemned the practice, calling it superstition, sin, or witchcraft. Yet they could not stop it entirely. The demand for love and desire was too strong. People wanted to believe that passion could be created, especially when their daily lives offered little space for it. The church warned of demonic influence, but the bottles continued to circulate. Vows adjusted their words, promising healing or comfort instead of love. But their clients understood the true purpose. As the image of someone slipping a few drops into a cup of wine captures the reality. The target drinks, unaware of the contents, and soon feels flushed or dizzy. They smile, laugh, or grow silent and dazed. The giver interprets this as proof that the potion has worked. Friends may nod knowingly, convinced they have witnessed magic. No one considers that the reaction was a simple chemical effect, not affection. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like confusing the side effects of a sleeping pill with proof of romantic attraction. Stories of love potions filled folklore. Tales of women who bewitched noblemen, of men who bound queens to them, of secret romances sparked by a single sip. These stories kept the trade alive, reinforcing the belief that the bottles held true power. In reality, the potions revealed more about human hope than about love. People wanted shortcuts, solutions to feelings they could not control. The bottles gave them the illusion of mastery, even when the outcome was harmful. The dangers were not hidden, though. Some who survived strong doses described terrifying experiences, pounding hearts, spinning rooms, voices echoing in their heads. Others awoke with no memory of the night before. The line between passion and violation was thin, and many abuses were carried out under the excuse of love potions. Communities rarely intervened, seeing the matter as private. Victims carried the consequences alone. Despite this, the belief in love potions persisted for centuries. Even as knowledge of medicine grew, the allure of a small bottle that promised desire did not disappear. It blended into the wider world of folk remedies, surviving alongside charms, prayers, and rituals. For many, it was easier to trust a secret vial than to face the uncertainty of human affection. I cannot help but think that if I had lived in such a time, longing for connection, I too might have bought one of those bottles, not caring what was inside as long as it promised love. The love potions of the Middle Ages show how intoxication and desire were linked. What people thought was passion was often nothing more than an altered perception. The blurred lines between chemistry and emotion gave rise to stories that shaped culture. In the end, the potions did not guarantee affection. They revealed how far people would go to feel wanted, even if it meant surrendering their health. From these bottles that promised love, but often delivered confusion, the story of intoxication moved on to another practice, where superstition and ritual combined to produce states of trance that were mistaken for cleansing of the soul. In many medieval villages, illness was not treated with herbs or prayers alone. It was often approached with a mixture of both, a blending of medicine and ritual that blurred the line between healing and belief. One common practice was the use of holy water, sometimes mixed quietly with herbs that carried toxic or sedative qualities. The water itself was blessed by priests, making it powerful in the eyes of the faithful. When combined with plant extracts, it produced effects on the body that people mistook for spiritual cleansing. The process often began with a sick person being led into the church or a small chamber near the altar. The priest or healer offered a cup of water, sometimes fragrant with added leaves or roots. The patient drank, not knowing that the mixture might contain herbs such as henbane, mandrake, or other mild poisons. Soon after, drowsiness set in, or visions appeared at the edge of consciousness. The congregation watching described the person as entering a sacred state. They believed the soul was being washed free of sin, even as the body trembled under the influence of chemicals. It is almost amusing that what was essentially poisoning was praised as the moment of purification. The ritual did not stop with drinking. Incense burned heavily in the room, filling the air with smoke that deepened the haze. Chanting followed, repetitive and slow, designed to focus the mind and wear down resistance. People stood for hours, rocking back and forth, repeating prayers until exhaustion added to the effect. The combination of drugged water, smoke-filled lungs, and monotonous sound created a trance. Observers saw the sick collapse, moan, or mutter strange words, and they took it as a sign that evil spirits were being forced out. For families, this experience was both terrifying and hopeful. Watching a loved one writhe or faint was painful, but they believed it was necessary. They were told that suffering meant the ritual was working. Quiet, still patient, was seen as a bad sign. Proof that demons refused to leave. A loud, convulsing patient, gave everyone hope that cleansing was near. The more dramatic the reaction, the more convinced the community became that sin and sickness were being removed. The church often reinforced these ideas. Priests described illness as a form of punishment for sin or as test of faith. Cleansing rituals allowed people to feel they were fighting back. The holy water was treated as a weapon against invisible enemies. When the patient awoke weak and confused, they were told it was a sign of renewal. No one considered that they were simply recovering from the effects of intoxication. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like giving a feverish patient a glass of sedative-laced water, then calling their collapse a sign that medicine had expelled evil. The social atmosphere of these rituals must have been heavy. Imagine a dark church filled with villages, smoke curling through the air, voices droning in prayer. At the center, a patient trembles, their eyes half closed, lips murmuring. The priest sprinkles more water, commands the spirit to leave, and the crowd gasps as the patient falls. The scene is powerful, convincing, and unforgettable. For those present, it is proof that faith and ritual worked. Such ceremonies also reinforce the authority of the church by controlling access to holy water and leading the chants. Priests placed themselves as the gatekeepers of health and salvation. Families relied on them not only for spiritual guidance, but also for survival. The rituals strengthened loyalty. Even if the patient worsened or died, the community rarely blamed the practice. Instead, they said the illness had been too strong, or the will of God had decided otherwise. The system protected itself from doubt. The ingredients used in these mixtures were known in folk medicine. Henbane could induce visions, mandrake could sedate, and other herbs could cause dizziness or paralysis. Healers outside the church used them cautiously, but inside rituals, they were masked by the blessing of holy water. People did not see poison. They saw purity. The line between natural effect and spiritual meaning vanished once the priest declared it holy. The consequences were not always positive. Some patients never recovered, dying during or after the ritual. Others grew weaker, unable to shake the after effects of the herbs. Families mourned, but accepted these deaths as a sacrifice. Survival was interpreted as proof of divine mercy. While death was described as release from sin, in both outcomes, the ritual was validated. No one questioned whether the water itself had harmed more than healed. These practices spread widely because they answered human needs. People wanted explanations for illness, and they wanted to feel they could act against it. Medicine was limited, knowledge scarce, and superstition filled the gap. Holy water rituals promised clarity even when the results were confusion. Villagers left convinced that they had done everything possible, and that was enough to give comfort. I cannot help but think that if I had lived, then faced with a sick relative and no real cure, I too would have welcomed any ritual, even if it meant giving them poisoned water, because it would have felt like doing something rather than nothing. The need for action is powerful, and in such times it was easily satisfied by ritual. The story of these half-conscious states shows how deeply intoxication was woven into medieval life without being recognized. People sought holiness, cleansing, and relief. And what they found instead were chemical reactions disguised as miracles. The line between faith and intoxication was blurred until it disappeared. From these smoky churches and bitter cups, the story of altered states returned to the wider community, where even without rituals, people discovered ways to slip into intoxication through ordinary foods gone bad. Looking back at the many ways people in the Middle Ages altered their states of mind, one theme stands out: They did not need powders, pills, or chemical laboratories to experience intoxication. Their world itself was enough. The smoke of incense, the bite of herbs, the strain of fasting, or the fermentation of bread and drink. All of these provided doors into states they could not explain. What later centuries would call hallucination, sedation, or addiction. They understood as holiness, mystery, or survival. The sources of these states were everywhere. A woman in a noble house dropped belladonna into her eyes, calling it beauty. A priest in a smoky church inhaled resin until his head swam, calling it closeness to God. A farmer ate rye bread infected with ergot and fell into visions, calling it possession by spirits. A healer brewed a mixture of roots that dulled pain, and a patient drank, calling it mercy. It is almost amusing that so many ordinary accidents of nature became sacred experiences. Simply because people lacked the language to describe chemistry, they did not set out to seek pleasure in these states. The aim was often endurance. Workers used laudanum to push through pain. Mothers gave drops to babies so they could rest. Pilgrims starved themselves until they saw visions that kept them walking. Communities burned incense not for euphoria, but for ritual. Intoxication was a side effect, not the goal. In this way, medieval people were surrounded by experiences of altered perception without calling them by that name. The social acceptance of these practices is striking. No one saw them as dangerous. They were normalized, passed from family to family, reinforced by priests, healers, and merchants. A bottle on a shelf, a root in a pouch, a cup of wine mixed with herbs. These were as ordinary as food or cloth. When someone collapsed, convulsed, or spoke of visions, explanations turned to spirits, saints, or sin, never toxication. The word did not exist for them, so the concept did not either. Their world was different from ours in this way. Today we draw a clear line between medicine, recreation, and intoxication. They did not. To them, a single plant could heal, poison, or open a path to the divine, depending on how it was used and who explained the effect. If we compare it to modern life, it would be like walking into a pharmacy and finding morphine, sedatives, and hallucinogen sitting on the same shelf as vitamins with no labels or warnings, and everyone calling them remedies. The effects shaped culture. Vishnaras influenced communities. Rituals defined faith. Even accidents like the dancing plagues caused by spoiled grain left marks in memory and legend. What might seem to us as episodes of mass intoxication became for them moments of fear or renewed belief. Their stories survived because they touched something deeper than the immediate experience. They became proof of God's presence or the devil's power. From the distance of centuries, it is easy to separate what was chemical from what was spiritual, yet at the time, there was no separation. People did not choose between the two. Their lives were framed by survival, ritual, and faith. And intoxication fit into all three. The mind is altered not by design, but by circumstance. Their explanations match their needs. It is important to remember that many of these practices were born from suffering. Pain relief was rare, and any substance that dulled agony was welcomed. Hunger was common, and visions helped people make sense of it. Fear of illness or death drove families to trust in rituals that made patients collapse. Even beauty was tied to harm as noble women risked their sight for widened pupils. Intoxication was not luxury. It was the texture of survival. Universality of these experiences is clear. Rich and poor alike shared them. Nobles sipped laudanum in silk rooms. Workers drank the same mixture in dark cottages. Priests inhaled incense in grand cathedrals. Villagers did the same in small chapels. Children, adults, and the elderly all came into contact with these substances. There was no class or age untouched. Altered states united society, even when no one named them. I cannot help but think that if I had lived in those centuries, surrounded by the same smoke, food, and rituals, I too would have accepted these states as normal parts of life. The very air, the meals, and the prayers would have carried me into places I could not explain, and I would not have questioned it. The story of medieval intoxication shows that human beings have always been close to substances and practices that change the mind. What differs is how we understand them. For medieval people, the environment itself supplied what was needed. No factories, no laboratories, no deliberate pursuit of pleasure. Only the daily mix of survival, belief, and nature's accidents. That was enough to send them beyond themselves, sometimes to comfort, sometimes to ruin. In the end, the Middle Ages remind us that intoxication is nothing new. It did not begin with modern drugs. It has always been present, hidden in leaves and roots, carried in smoke and in hunger. What changes is only the way we explain it. They saw spirits and salvation where we see chemicals and biology, yet the sensation, the lightness, the visions, the haze remains much the same. The people of that time needed no modern narcotics to feel altered. Their world was both their pharmacy and their trap. And to them, it was not intoxication at all, but faith, survival, and life. Thank you for joining me here in the Boring Sleep Library on this quiet journey into the hidden intoxications of the Middle Ages. May your night be softer, calmer, and more peaceful than theirs often were. Sleep well, and good night.